The wind carving through the dunes of the Arabian Peninsula does not merely shape the sand. For centuries, it shaped the people. To understand the genesis of one of history's most sweeping transformative movements, you must first understand the crucible in which it was forged. By the dawn of the 7th century, the world beyond this blistering expanse was locked in the apocalyptic struggles of superpowers. To the northwest, the Byzantine Empire, cloaked in the legacy of Rome, engaged in a seemingly endless war of attrition against the Sassanid Persian Empire to the east. Yet, between these warring titans lay a fractured, unforgiving landscape that the great emperors deemed too hostile to conquer and too barren to tame. They looked at the desert and saw only a wasteland, entirely missing the storm that was gathering within it. In this isolated theater of rugged mountains, fertile but secluded oases, and endless seas of shifting sand, society operated on a razor's edge. Survival here was not an individual pursuit. It was entirely dependent on the collective strength of the tribe. The social fabric was a tight, rigid web of lineage, blood, and honor. Justice was not an abstract concept administered by a state. It was fiercely loyal, personal, and absolute. If a drop of blood was spilled, tribal law demanded an equal measure in return, trapping entire generations in relentless, consuming blood feuds where loyalty to one's kin superseded all other moral considerations. It was a world that was at once beautiful in its starkness and deeply, unapologetically brutal. At the beating heart of this arid world lay a valley that held no strategic military value, yet commanded the spiritual and economic devotion of the entire peninsula, the city of Mecca. Mecca was a paradox of a city. It was a bustling, chaotic, and relentlessly ambitious nexus of commerce. Long, winding caravans carrying frankincense, myrrh, silks, and spices from Africa, the Byzantine territories, and Persia bottlenecked through its narrow, dust-choked streets. But its true power did not stem from its markets. It stemmed from a mysterious, ancient, cube-like sanctuary sitting at the city's center, the Kaaba. Long before the birth of Islam, the Kaaba was deeply revered, serving as a sacred zone where the drawing of weapons and the shedding of blood were strictly forbidden. Within its shadows sat the idols of hundreds of different tribal deities, representing a massive pantheon of Arabian gods. Pilgrims from across the vast deserts would converge on Mecca during sacred months to honor these deities, creating a massive influx of wealth, trade, and cultural exchange. The custodians of this sacred and highly lucrative franchise were the Quraysh, a powerful, aristocratic tribe who manipulated this spiritual monopoly to amass staggering wealth and absolute political dominance over the region. They were the undisputed lords of Mecca, acting as heavily armed gatekeepers to the gods. They protected their hierarchy, their trade routes, and their absolute authority with ruthless efficiency. Society under their rule was rigidly stratified. Nobles and wealthy merchants lived in opulence, while slaves, artisans, and marginalized groups existed to serve the economic machine. Women were largely relegated to roles defined by the patriarchal authority of their male relatives, heavily dependent on tribal customs for whatever meager security they could find. But among the merchants, the enslaved, and the travelers passing through, a quiet dissonance was taking root. The Arabian Peninsula was not entirely cut off from the broader spiritual currents of late antiquity. Monotheistic whispers echoed along the trade routes. Jewish tribes cultivated the northern oases, Christian communities flourished to the south in Yemen, and a small, enigmatic group of local Arabs, known as the Hanifs, actively rejected the idols of the Kaaba, searching instead for the singular, unseen God of their ancestor, Abraham. It is here, in this pressure cooker of staggering socio-economic inequality, fierce tribal loyalty, and spiritual fragmentation, that our story finds its anchor. Around the year 570 CE, into the formidable Quraysh tribe, specifically the modest Hashim clan, a boy was born. His name was Muhammad, His entry into this deeply status-obsessed society was marred by immediate tragedy. He never knew his father, who died before the boy took his first breath. By the time he was a young child, the unforgiving reality of the era claimed his mother as well, leaving him entirely orphaned. In a society where a person's worth, leverage, and physical safety were directly tethered to the wealth and power of their immediate family, to be an orphan was to be acutely, perilously vulnerable. He was taken in first by his grandfather, and upon his death, the boy's guardianship fell to his uncle, Abu Talib. While the Quraysh elite reveled in the immense profits of the Kaaba's pilgrimage trade, the young Muhammad lived a life of stark humility. He was sent out of the bustling, polluted city limits to work the arid slopes as a shepherd. This was not the life of a prince in waiting. It was a life of profound isolation, silence, and intense observation. Watching over flocks under the vast, unpolluted canopy of the desert sky, the young man was far removed from the materialistic frenzy of his peers. This isolation afforded him the time to learn the cadence of nature, the virtue of patience, and to reflect on the immense hardships that defined human existence. As he grew into manhood, he transitioned from tending sheep to navigating the treacherous trade routes to places like Syria as a caravan merchant. It was grueling, dangerous work, requiring sharp wits and an unshakable character. And it was his character that began to draw attention. In a city where deception was often just considered good business, he operated with a transparency that was startling. He was fair in his dealings, and he guarded his integrity fiercely. Before he ever claimed to speak for the divine, the people of Mecca bestowed upon him a unique title. They called him *Alamin*, the trustworthy. This sterling reputation eventually reached the ears of one of Mecca's most remarkable figures, Khadija. She was a fiercely independent, highly respected, and phenomenally wealthy widow who commanded her own vast trading empire. Recognizing a rare integrity, she hired the young Muhammad to manage her most critical caravans, an incredibly high level of trust to place in an outsider during that era. He did not disappoint. His journeys on her behalf exposed him to the wider world, bringing him face to face with the diverse tapestries of Christian and Jewish theology, expanding his worldview far beyond the valley of his birth, and igniting a deep curiosity about life's ultimate purpose. Impressed not just by his business acumen, but by the quiet dignity of his soul, Khadija made a highly unconventional move for the era. She proposed marriage to him. Despite an age gap of 15 years, she was 40, he was 25. Their union blossomed into a profound, egalitarian partnership defined by deep affection and unwavering mutual respect. Together they raised a family, and she became his rock, his anchor. Khadija was his greatest confidant, the one person who saw the entirety of his spirit and believed in him with an absolute, unyielding conviction. Yet, despite finding financial stability and a deeply loving home, a pervasive, agonizing melancholy began to take hold of Muhammad as he approached his late 30s. He looked at the city of Mecca and felt a profound revulsion. The wealth of the Quraysh was built on a foundation of extreme social injustice. The weak and destitute were relentlessly exploited by the powerful. The idols in the Kaaba felt hollow to him, lifeless blocks of stone manipulated by the elite to keep the masses in spiritual and financial servitude, completely devoid of any universal moral law. He could no longer stomach the noise. To find clarity, he began to flee the city for days at a time, seeking the absolute isolation of the stark desert mountains. His sanctuary was a small, jagged opening high up on the treacherous slopes of Mount Hira, just outside the city. Here, suspended above the world, he would sit in the suffocating silence of the cave, fasting, meditating, and reflecting on the suffering he witnessed in the streets below. His soul was in turmoil, desperately yearning for a truth, a moral order in a chaotic universe that seemed entirely devoid of one. He was waiting for an answer in the dark. Then, One night in the year 610 CE, during the 27th day of the month of Ramadan, the silence of the desert was shattered. What happened inside the Cave of Hira is recorded as one of the most terrifying, paradigm-shifting encounters in human history. In the dead of the night, the 40-year-old Muhammad was suddenly enveloped by an overwhelming, crushing presence. It was not a gentle spiritual awakening. He later described it as an intense, almost unbearable physical power, unlike anything he had ever experienced. Out of this overwhelming pressure, a voice, commanding, insistent, and vibrating with an unearthly authority, issued a single, absolute imperative. "Read." Trembling, his heart hammering against his ribs, Muhammad stammered his reply. "I am not one to read." He was, like many of his peers, entirely illiterate. The presence seemed to squeeze him again, the command coming stronger, more insistent. Again, he pleaded his inability. The pressure became immense, a physical manifestation of divine weight, until finally, the voice delivered the words that would alter the trajectory of human civilization forever, unlocking a surge of understanding deep within his mind. "Recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clinging substance. Recite, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen taught man that which he knew not." The words did not just enter his ears, they seemed to be branded into his very soul. The message spoke of a creator of immense wisdom and compassion, a jarring contrast to the cold, transactional idol worship of Mecca. The sheer magnitude of the encounter left him completely overwhelmed. When the presence finally vanished, it left behind a profound, ringing silence. Exhausted, terrified, and violently trembling, Muhammad stumbled out of the cave and scrambled down the jagged rocks of Mount Hira. He was not filled with joyous enlightenment. His mind was reeling with raw, primal terror. In the ancient world, encounters with the unseen were deeply feared. Was he losing his mind? Had he been possessed by a malicious desert spirit, or touched by madness? He fled through the darkened streets of Mecca, bursting through the doors of his home in a state of absolute bewilderment. He collapsed before Khadijah, desperate for comfort, begging her to wrap him in blankets to hide him from the crushing reality of what he had just experienced. As he poured out the terrifying details of the cave, the voice, the crushing weight, the mysterious words, and confessed his fear that he had lost his sanity, Khadijah did not panic. She did not doubt him. With a calm, unshakable certainty, she looked at the man she knew better than anyone and anchored him back to reality. "By God," she reassured him, her voice steady against his trembling. "God would never disgrace you. You keep good relations with your kin, help the poor and the destitute, serve your guests generously, and assist those who are stricken by calamity." In her eyes, his unparalleled virtue was proof that this experience was genuine, not a demonic trick. But Khadijah knew they needed context. They needed someone who understood the ancient, complex currents of theology. With calm determination, she took her shaken husband to her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal. Waraka was an elderly Christian scholar, a man who had spent his life meticulously studying the ancient scriptures of Judaism and Christianity. The old man listened intently in the quiet room as Muhammad recounted the crushing embrace, the unearthly voice, and the exact words spoken in the dark. When Muhammad finished, Waraka sat in stunned silence. He recognized the pattern immediately. The weight of history settled heavily over the room. "This is the same spirit that came to Moses," the old scholar finally declared, his voice thick with awe. "You have been chosen as a prophet." But before Muhammad could fully process the earth-shattering magnitude of this validation, Waraka delivered a chilling warning. "I wish I were young," the old man rasped, his tone shifting to one of deep, sorrowful certainty, "and could live until the day your people turn you out." Muhammad was shocked. Drive him out? How could that be possible? He was *Alamin*. He was universally respected by his people, but Waraka knew the immutable law of human history. The revelation in the cave was not just a personal spiritual awakening. It was a radical, existential threat to to the very power structures that the Quraysh depended upon. A message of absolute equality and a single divine authority would strike directly at the economic heart of Mecca. The silence of the desert had broken, and a new spiritual force had been unleashed, one that was about to demand the ultimate price. The wind carving through the dunes of the Arabian Peninsula does not merely shape the sand. For centuries, it shaped the people. To understand the genesis of one of history's most sweeping, transformative movements, you must first understand the crucible in which it was forged. By the dawn of the 7th century, the world beyond this blistering expanse was locked in the apocalyptic struggles of superpowers. To the northwest, the Byzantine Empire, cloaked in the legacy of Rome, engaged in a seemingly endless war of attrition against the Sassanid Persian Empire to the east. Yet, between these warring titans lay a fractured, unforgiving landscape that the great emperors deemed too hostile to conquer and too barren to tame. They looked at the desert and saw only a wasteland, entirely missing the storm that was gathering within it. In this isolated theater of rugged mountains, fertile but secluded oases, and endless seas of shifting sand, society operated on a razor's edge. Survival here was not an individual pursuit. It was entirely dependent on the collective strength of the tribe. The social fabric was a tight, rigid web of lineage, blood, and honor. Justice was not an abstract concept administered by a state. It was fiercely loyal, personal, and absolute. If a drop of blood was spilled, tribal law demanded an equal measure in return, trapping entire generations in relentless, consuming blood feuds where loyalty to one's kin superseded all other moral considerations. It was a world that was at once beautiful in its starkness and deeply, unapologetically brutal. At the beating heart of this arid world lay a valley that held no strategic military value, yet commanded the spiritual and economic devotion of the entire peninsula, the city of Mecca. Mecca was a paradox of a city. It was a bustling, chaotic, and relentlessly ambitious nexus of commerce. Long, winding caravans carrying frankincense, myrrh, silks, and spices from Africa, the Byzantine territories, and Persia bottlenecked through its narrow, dust-choked streets. But its true power did not stem from its markets. It stemmed from a mysterious, ancient, cube-like sanctuary sitting at the city's center, the Kaaba. Long before the birth of Islam, the Kaaba was deeply revered, serving as a sacred zone where the drawing of weapons and the shedding of blood were strictly forbidden. Within its shadows sat the idols of hundreds of different tribal deities, representing a massive pantheon of Arabian gods. Pilgrims from across the vast deserts would converge on Mecca during sacred months to honor these deities, creating a massive influx of wealth, trade, and cultural exchange. The custodians of this sacred and highly lucrative franchise were the Quraysh, a powerful, aristocratic tribe who manipulated this spiritual monopoly to amass staggering wealth and absolute political dominance over the region. They were the undisputed lords of Mecca, acting as heavily armed gatekeepers to the gods. They protected their hierarchy, their trade routes, and their absolute authority with ruthless efficiency. Society under their rule was rigidly stratified. Nobles and wealthy merchants lived in opulence, while slaves, artisans, and marginalized groups existed to serve the economic machine. Women were largely relegated to roles defined by the patriarchal authority of their male relatives, heavily dependent on tribal customs for whatever meager security they could find. But among the merchants, the enslaved, and the travelers passing through, a quiet dissonance was taking root. The Arabian Peninsula was not entirely cut off from the broader spiritual currents of late antiquity. Monotheistic whispers echoed along the trade routes. Jewish tribes cultivated the northern oases, Christian communities flourished to the south in Yemen, and a small, enigmatic group of local Arabs, known as the Hanifs, actively rejected the idols of the Kaaba, searching instead for the singular, unseen God of their ancestor. Abraham. It is here, in this pressure cooker of staggering socio-economic inequality, fierce tribal loyalty, and spiritual fragmentation, that our story finds its anchor. Around the year 570 CE, into the formidable Quraysh tribe, specifically the modest Hashim clan, a boy was born. His name was Muhammad. His entry into this deeply status-obsessed society was marred by immediate tragedy. He never knew his father, who died before the boy took his first breath. By the time he was a young child, the unforgiving reality of the era claimed his mother as well, leaving him entirely orphaned. In a society where a person's worth, leverage, and physical safety were directly tethered to the wealth and power of their immediate family, to be an orphan was to be acutely, perilously vulnerable. He was taken in first by his grandfather, and upon his death, the boy's guardianship fell to his uncle, Abu Talib. While the Quraysh elite reveled in the immense profits of the Kaaba's pilgrimage trade, the young Muhammad lived a life of stark humility. He was sent out of the bustling, polluted city limits to work the arid slopes as a shepherd. This was not the life of a prince in waiting. It was a life of profound isolation, silence, and intense observation. Watching over flocks under the vast, unpolluted canopy of the desert sky, the young man was far removed from the materialistic frenzy of his peers. This isolation afforded him the time to learn the cadence of nature, the virtue of patience, and to reflect on the immense hardships that defined human existence. As he grew into manhood, he transitioned from tending sheep to navigating the treacherous trade routes to places like Syria as a caravan merchant. It was grueling, dangerous work, requiring sharp wits and an unshakable character. And it was his character that began to draw attention. In a city where deception was often just considered good business, he operated with a transparency that was startling. He was fair in his dealings, and he guarded his integrity fiercely. Before he ever claimed to speak for the divine, the people of Mecca bestowed upon him a unique title. They called him *Alamin*, the trustworthy. This sterling reputation eventually reached the ears of one of Mecca's most remarkable figures, Khadija. She was a fiercely independent, highly respected, and phenomenally wealthy widow who commanded her own vast trading empire. Recognizing a rare integrity, she hired the young Muhammad to manage her most critical caravans, an incredibly high level of trust to place in an outsider during that era. He did not disappoint. His journeys on her behalf exposed him to the wider world, bringing him face to face with the diverse tapestries of Christian and Jewish theology, expanding his worldview far beyond the valley of his birth, and igniting a deep curiosity about life's ultimate purpose. Impressed not just by his business acumen, but by the quiet dignity of his soul, Khadija made a highly unconventional move for the era. She proposed marriage to him. Despite an age gap of 15 years, she was 40, he was 25. Their union blossomed into a profound, egalitarian partnership defined by deep affection and unwavering mutual respect. Together they raised a family, and she became his rock, his anchor. Khadija was his greatest confidant, the one person who saw the entirety of his spirit and believed in him with an absolute, unyielding conviction. Yet, despite finding financial stability and a deeply loving home, a pervasive, agonizing melancholy began to take hold of Muhammad as he approached his late 30s. He looked at the city of Mecca and felt a profound revulsion. The wealth of the Quraysh was built on a foundation of extreme social injustice. The weak and destitute were relentlessly exploited by the powerful. The idols in the Kaaba felt hollow to him, lifeless blocks of stone manipulated by the elite to keep the masses in spiritual and financial servitude, completely devoid of any universal moral law. He could no longer stomach the noise. To find clarity, he began to flee the city for days at a time, seeking the absolute isolation of the stark desert mountains. His sanctuary was a small, jagged opening high up on the treacherous slopes of Mount Hira, just outside the city. Here, suspended above the world, he would sit in the suffocating silence of the cave, fasting, meditating, and reflecting on the suffering he witnessed in the streets below. His soul was in turmoil, desperately yearning for a truth, a moral order in a chaotic universe that seemed entirely devoid of one. He was waiting for an answer in the dark. Then, one night in the year 610 CE, during the 27th day of the month of Ramadan, the silence of the desert was shattered. What happened inside the Cave of Hira is recorded as one of the most terrifying, paradigm-shifting encounters in human history. In the dead of the night, the 40-year-old Muhammad was suddenly enveloped by an overwhelming, crushing presence. It was not a gentle, spiritual awakening. He later described it as an intense, almost unbearable physical power, unlike anything he had ever experienced. Out of this overwhelming pressure, a voice, commanding, insistent, and vibrating with an unearthly authority, issued a single, absolute imperative. Read. Trembling, his heart hammering against his ribs, Muhammad stammered his reply. I am not one to read. He was, like many of his peers, entirely illiterate. The presence seemed to squeeze him again, the command coming stronger, more insistent. Again, he pleaded his inability. The pressure became immense, a physical manifestation of divine weight, until finally, the voice delivered the words that would alter the trajectory of human civilization forever, unlocking a surge of understanding deep within his mind. Recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clinging substance. Recite, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not. The words did not just enter his ears, they seemed to be branded into his very soul. The message spoke of a creator of immense wisdom and compassion, a jarring contrast to the cold, transactional idol worship of Mecca. The sheer magnitude of the encounter left him completely overwhelmed. When the presence finally vanished, it left behind a profound, ringing silence. Exhausted, terrified, and violently trembling, Muhammad stumbled out of the cave and scrambled down the jagged rocks of Mount Hira. He was not filled with joyous enlightenment. His mind was reeling with raw, primal terror. In the ancient world, encounters with the unseen were deeply feared. Was he losing his mind? Had he been possessed by a malicious desert spirit or touched by madness? He fled through the darkened streets of Mecca, bursting through the doors of his home in a state of absolute bewilderment. He collapsed before Khadija, desperate for comfort, begging her to wrap him in blankets to hide him from the crushing reality of what he had just experienced. As he poured out the terrifying details of the cave, the voice, the crushing weight, the mysterious words, and confessed his fear that he had lost his sanity, Khadija did not panic. She did not doubt him. With a calm, unshakable certainty, she looked at the man she knew better than anyone and anchored him back to reality. By God, she reassured him, her voice steady against his trembling. God would never disgrace you. You keep good relations with your kin, help the poor and the destitute, serve your guests generously, and assist those who are stricken by calamity. In her eyes, his unparalleled virtue was proof that this experience was genuine, not a demonic trick. But Khadija knew they needed context. They needed someone who understood the ancient, complex currents of theology. With calm determination, she took her shaken husband to her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal. Waraka was an elderly Christian scholar, a man who had spent his life meticulously studying the ancient scriptures of Judaism and Christianity. The old man listened intently in the quiet room as Muhammad recounted the crushing embrace, the unearthly voice, and the exact words spoken in the dark. When Muhammad finished, Waraka sat in stunned silence. He recognized the pattern immediately. The weight of history settled heavily over the room. This is the same spirit that came to Moses, the old scholar finally declared, his voice thick with awe. You have been chosen as a prophet. But before Muhammad could fully process the earth-shattering magnitude of this validation, Waraka delivered a chilling warning. I wish I were young, the old man rasped, his tone shifting to one of deep, sorrowful certainty, and could live until the day your people turn you out. Muhammad was shocked. Drive him out? How could that be possible? He was *alam in asterisk. He was universally respected by his people, but Waraka knew the immutable law of human history. The revelation in the cave was not just a personal spiritual awakening. It was a radical, existential threat to the very power structures that the Quraysh depended upon. A message of absolute equality and a single divine authority would strike directly at the economic heart of Mecca. The silence of the desert had broken, and a new spiritual force had been unleashed, one that was about to demand the ultimate price. Waraka's chilling prophecy hung in the air, a heavy, suffocating promise of exile. Yet, in the immediate aftermath of the revelation on Mount Hira, the most profound agony Muhammad faced was not the wrath of his people, but an agonizing, unbroken silence from the heavens. He returned to the rhythms of his daily life, a man carrying a secret of cosmic proportions, waiting for the commanding voice to speak again. Days dragged into weeks. Weeks stretched on, bleeding into a hollow, terrifying quiet. The crushing presence that had squeezed the breath from his lungs in the cave did not return. In the vacuum left by the divine, a cold, creeping dread began to take root in his mind. Had the experience been real? Had he hallucinated the entire encounter? Or worse, had he been chosen only to be immediately abandoned because he was found unworthy? Desperate for clarity, driven by an ache he could barely articulate, he haunted the jagged slopes of Mount Hira once more. He climbed back into the shadows of the cave, hoping to spark the connection, searching the empty desert winds for a sign. But the mountain offered nothing but silence. Just as the psychological weight of doubt threatened to break him, the barrier between worlds tore open once again. The voice returned. It descended not with the terrifying pressure of the first encounter, but with a firm, steadying reassurance, revealing further verses that spoke of patience, of unyielding perseverance, and of a divine purpose that had not abandoned him. The verses rolling through his consciousness crystallized his understanding of the colossal task ahead. He was not merely meant to be a passive vessel for divine recitation. He was being called to act as a radical reformer. His mission was to fracture the ruthless, deeply entrenched socio-economic hierarchy of Mecca and replace it with a framework built on compassion, absolute justice, and a unifying moral law. It was a responsibility of staggering, terrifying proportions, and from that moment on, the sheer weight of it never left his shoulders. Knowing the volatile nature of the Quraysh, Muhammad did not immediately stand in the bustling courtyard of the Kaaba to declare the death of their gods. The revolution began in the shadows. He kept the revelations strictly guarded, sharing the terrifying and beautiful truth of the mountain only with a fiercely intimate circle of confidants. Khadija was his bedrock, stepping forward as his very first follower, her faith in his prophetic role absolute and unshakable. Soon, a quiet vanguard began to form around them. It included his young, fiercely loyal cousin, Ali, his adopted son, Zayd, and Abu Bakr, a highly respected and wealthy merchant whose own search for spiritual truth aligned perfectly with Muhammad's message. Together, in the hidden courtyards and shuttered rooms of Mecca, this tiny, clandestine community bowed their heads in secret prayer. They whispered verses that envisioned an egalitarian society, reciting words that promised a merciful God who abhorred the exploitation of the weak. But an ideology that demands the total restructuring of society cannot survive indefinitely in the dark. Muhammad knew that his message was not a private intellectual exercise reserved for a chosen elite. It was a universal imperative intended for everyone. The friction was inevitable. The entire economy of Mecca, its immense geopolitical power, its wealth, its status as the untouchable jewel of Arabia, was entirely predicated on the Kaaba and the hundreds of idols housed within it. To challenge polytheism was not merely a theological debate. It was an act of high treason against the financial and political establishment of the Quraysh. The words Muhammad carried were the ultimate disruption, threatening to dismantle the very mechanisms of power the city's elites relied upon. Despite knowing the collision would be violent, an inescapable resolve hardened within his chest. The time for secrecy had ended. Muhammad stepped out into the blinding light of the Meccan public sphere. He began to openly invite the people of the city to abandon their ancestral idols, to live with uncompromising integrity, and to submit to a single, unseen creator, Allah. The initial reaction from the Quraysh aristocracy was not immediate violence, but rather a mix of deep suspicion and dismissive ridicule. To the hardened, wealthy elite, Muhammad's insistence on the oneness of God seemed like the harmless, perhaps pathetic eccentricity of an overly devout man. At worst, they viewed it as a naive nuisance, challenging their ancient, highly profitable traditions. But as Muhammad's voice rang out through the markets and alleyways, an unintended audience began to listen. The message struck a profound chord with those whom the Meccan hierarchy had ground into the dust: the disenfranchised, the desperately poor, the enslaved, and the women of the city, those who possessed absolutely no leverage or voice under the cruel, wealth-driven tribal system, heard in Muhammad's recitations something incredibly dangerous: hope. Islam offered them a revolutionary promise of ultimate justice, declaring that before the eyes of the divine, a slave and a king held the exact same worth. This fiercely egalitarian principle acted as a magnet for the marginalized, and to the shock of the ruling class, Muhammad's small circle of followers began to rapidly swell. The laughter of the Quraysh abruptly ceased. What had started as a theological curiosity had mutated into an existential threat to their authority. Key leaders within the powerful Meccan clans, including Muhammad's own uncle, Abu Lahab, turned violently hostile. They realized this movement was a direct, calculated attack on the social stratification that kept their coffers full. If the masses believed in equality, the entire system of tribal exploitation would collapse. Seeking to sever the head of the movement without inciting a massive, chaotic blood feud with Muhammad's clan, the Quraysh elite approached his powerful uncle and protector, Abu Talib. Though Abu Talib had not embraced Islam himself, tribal honor dictated he protect his nephew at all costs. The elite laid out a desperate, calculated ultimatum, urging Abu Talib to silence the young prophet. They offered Muhammad everything a man of the era could possibly desire: unimaginable wealth, elevated social status, and absolute political power, if only he would abandon his disruptive preaching. When Abu Talib presented this staggering bribe to his nephew, hoping to defuse a crisis that could tear their city apart, Muhammad did not hesitate. His reply echoed with an unyielding, unbreakable conviction that proved this was no mere political ambition. "If they place the sun in my right hand," he told his uncle, his gaze steady, "and the moon in my left, even then I would not abandon this message." The staggering finality of his refusal sent a shockwave through the upper echelons of Mecca. The Quraysh elite realized in that moment that Muhammad could not be bought, he could not be intimidated, and he would not be silenced. Diplomacy had failed. The only tool left to them was terror. The streets of Mecca, once vibrant with the lucrative chatter of global commerce, rapidly morphed into an arena of psychological and physical warfare. The ruling Quraysh, having realized that neither unimaginable wealth nor the threat of political ruin could deter Muhammad, unleashed a systematic campaign to crush the movement before it could unravel their society. At first, the assault was waged in the shadows of reputation. The elites flooded the city with vicious propaganda, branding the prophet a madman, a poet possessed by malevolent spirits, and a dangerous liar. They hurled insults and filth at him as he walked the public squares, attempting to humiliate him into silence. Yet, the hostility only seemed to forge a harder steel within the early Muslim community. Working quietly behind the scenes, Abu Bakr, a man whose wealth and diplomatic tact commanded immense respect, leveraged his influence within the upper echelons of Meccan society. Through his meticulous efforts, powerful and highly capable figures like Uthman ibn Affan and Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas quietly pledged their allegiance to the new faith. The movement was no longer just a gathering of the destitute. It was beginning to fracture the nobility itself. Furious and legally barred from executing Muhammad due to the ironclad tribal protection of his uncle, Abu Talib, the Quraysh turned their wrath upon those who had no shields. They targeted the most vulnerable, the foreigners, the impoverished, and the enslaved. The persecution was not merely cruel, it was designed to be a highly visible, theatrical display of dominance. The Arabian sun at midday is not just hot, it is a blinding, oppressive force that turns the sand into a furnace. It was into this furnace that an enslaved man named Bilal ibn Rabah was dragged. His master, enraged by Bilal's quiet but unyielding conversion to Islam, ordered him to be pinned beneath the scorching sky. Massive, suffocating boulders were hauled from the mountainside and placed squarely onto Bilal's chest, crushing the air from his lungs while the superheated sand burned his skin. The demand was simple: renounce the Prophet, curse the single God, and pray to the idols of the Kaaba, and the agony would end. But lying beneath the crushing weight of Meccan tyranny, Bilal refused to give them the satisfaction of his surrender. Gasping for air, he repeated a single, defiant phrase that would echo through the centuries. Ahad, Ahad. Asterisk 1, 1. Asterisk Bilal's staggering physical resilience became a blazing symbol for the entire movement. If an enslaved man could withstand the absolute worst the Quraysh could inflict without breaking, the ideological foundation of Mecca was already crumbling. However, Muhammad was not a leader who romanticized the suffering of his people. Watching his followers endure brutal torture tore at his heart. Realizing he lacked the political leverage to physically protect the most vulnerable among them, he orchestrated a brilliant and desperate geopolitical maneuver. He advised a small, vulnerable contingent of his followers to flee the Arabian Peninsula altogether. Their destination was the kingdom of Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, lying across the treacherous waters of the Red Sea. It was an incredibly risky voyage into the unknown, but Muhammad knew that the region was ruled by a Christian king of renowned justice, the Negus, Ashama ibn Abjar. When the Meccan refugees arrived, destitute and fleeing for their lives, they threw themselves upon the mercy of the Negus. The Quraysh, horrified that their prey had escaped, sent envoys laden with expensive gifts to extradite the Muslims. But the Christian king listened to the refugees recite the verses of the Quran, words that honored the one God, and recognized a profound, shared spiritual lineage. He refused the Meccan bribes and granted the Muslims absolute asylum. This daring escape was a monumental milestone, the first documented moment of profound interfaith sanctuary and respect in the history of Islam. Back in Mecca, the news of the Abyssinian sanctuary sent the Quraysh leadership into a blinding rage. Muhammad was outmaneuvering them on the international stage. Desperate to choke out the movement once and for all, the leaders of the ruling clans convened and drafted a terrifying new protocol. If they could not kill Muhammad, they would starve him, and everyone who stood with him, into submission. They initiated a total, merciless socio-economic boycott against Muhammad's entire clan, the Banu Hashim. A formal decree was written and suspended inside the Kaaba itself, declaring that no Meccan would trade with, marry into, or sell a single grain of wheat to anyone from the Banu Hashim. The entire clan, including those who were not even Muslims, were forced out of their homes and driven into a desolate, craggy ravine on the harsh outskirts of the city. For 3 agonizing years, the boycott held. The valley became an open-air prison. Wealthy merchants who had once commanded vast caravans were reduced to boiling the leaves of desert shrubs to stave off the gnawing pains of starvation. At night, the darkness of the ravine echoed with a sound that haunted the prophet and his companions, the relentless, echoing cries of starving children. They lived completely on the absolute fringe of human endurance, surviving only on smuggled scraps provided by a handful of secret sympathizers brave enough to defy the Quraysh. Yet, amidst the hunger, the disease, and the biting cold of the desert nights, the community did not fracture. Muhammad lived in the dirt alongside them, his presence offering a quiet, unyielding strength that bonded the believers together with an unbreakable solidarity. Eventually, the sheer inhumanity of the blockade disgusted even some of the hardened Quraysh elites, and the boycott formally collapsed, allowing the survivors to return to the city. But the victory was a hollow one. The valley had taken a devastating, irreversible toll on the physical bodies of those the Prophet loved most. Shortly after their return to Mecca, Muhammad faced a dual blow that nearly brought him to his knees. The prolonged starvation and severe conditions proved too much for Khadija. The wealthy aristocrat who had given up her empire, her comfort, and her social standing to stand beside him in the dirt of the ravine finally succumbed to her weakened state. Khadija, his ultimate confidant, his first believer, and the great love of his life, passed away. Before the tears for his wife could even dry, tragedy struck again. Abu Talib, his uncle and fiercely loyal protector, also died. History remembers this devastating chapter as the year of sorrow. The grief was suffocating. Muhammad was plunged into a profound, isolating darkness. He had lost his emotional anchor in Khadija, and with the death of Abu Talib, he lost his tribal shield. Without his uncle's protection, Muhammad's blood was essentially made legal to spill in Mecca. He was utterly exposed, grieving, and standing at the absolute lowest point of his life. The Quraysh predators began to circle, sensing that the Prophet was finally broken, and that the ultimate end of Islam was merely days away. But out of this total, crushing darkness, a miraculous event was about to shatter the boundaries of the physical world, offering the grieving Prophet a journey that defied the very laws of space, time, and human comprehension. The air in Mecca hung heavy with the scent of dust and impending doom. In the wake of the devastating year of sorrow, the Prophet Muhammad found himself entirely stripped of his earthly shields. Sleeping in the shadow of the Kaaba, the very sanctuary that had been weaponized by the Quraysh against his movement, he was a man engulfed by a profound, isolating grief. The city around him was hostile, waiting for the inevitable moment when his unprotected blood would finally be spilled. But on one particular night, the crushing gravity of human politics and tribal vengeance was instantly shattered by an event that transcended the physical boundaries of the known world. As Muhammad rested near the ancient stone walls of the sanctuary, the fabric of reality seemed to fold. The archangel Gabriel, the same celestial messenger who had squeezed the breath from his lungs in the Cave of Hira, descended into the Meccan night. Gabriel did not come with another terrifying command, but with a magnificent, unearthly invitation. He presented the grieving prophet with a creature completely unknown to the natural world, the Burak. Described in tradition as a radiant, winged steed, the Burak possessed a speed that defied human comprehension, moving with the sheer velocity of light. What followed is known as the Asterisk Isra and Miraj Asterisk, the night journey and ascension, an event that would become one of the most fiercely debated, wondrous, and pivotal moments in Islamic history. Mounting the radiant creature, Muhammad was carried instantly from the suffocating, hostile valleys of Mecca, sweeping across the vast, starlit expanse of the Arabian desert to the ancient, sacred city of Jerusalem. In the blink of an eye, he arrived at the precinct of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This was not a random destination. Jerusalem was the deeply entrenched spiritual epicenter of all monotheistic history. As Muhammad dismounted, he he was not alone. In an ethereal gathering that bridged the ancient past with the present, the prophet found himself standing among the monumental patriarchs of faith. Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and a vast assembly of previous messengers had materialized in the sacred precinct. In a moment of breathtaking symbolic weight, demonstrating the unbroken, unified continuum of the divine message, Muhammad stepped forward. He led this assembly of history's greatest prophets in prayer. This act was a profound cosmic validation, cementing his role not as a disruptor of the ancient faiths, but as the final seal in a long, unbroken lineage of divine messengers. Yet, the journey was far from over. From the sacred grounds of Jerusalem, Gabriel guided Muhammad upward, tearing through the veil of the earthly realm and ascending into the cosmos. They traversed through the 7 immense layers of heaven. At each celestial stratum, the prophet was welcomed by the very messengers he had just led in prayer, greeted with immense warmth, respect, and solidarity by the prophets who had walked the earth before him. This ascension was a journey of ultimate spiritual elevation, perfectly counterbalancing the crushing earthly humiliation he had endured during the Meccan boycott. Finally, passing beyond the limits of angelic comprehension, Muhammad reached the highest pinnacle of existence. He was granted an audience in the absolute proximity of Allah, experiencing a closeness to the divine creator that no human being had ever achieved. In this realm of profound humility and majestic silence, he was given a specific, monumental directive for his people on earth: the establishment of the 5 daily prayers. This was not meant to be a mere ritualistic burden. It was designed as a spiritual lifeline, a vital, rhythmic practice to ground the Muslim community, ensuring that no matter the physical persecution they faced, their minds and hearts would remain anchored to the divine 5 times a day. When Muhammad finally returned to the physical world, waking in the dawn light of Mecca, the residual energy of the cosmos still pulsed within him. His grief had been completely eclipsed by a renewed, unshakable spiritual strength. He now possessed absolute clarity regarding the vast, transcendent nature of his mission, a mission that connected humanity across all space and time. But this divine clarity immediately collided with a brutal earthly dilemma. How does a man living in an aggressively pragmatic, profit-driven society explain that he has just traveled to Jerusalem, ascended through the heavens, and spoken with God, all in a single night? He knew the admission would invite unimaginable ridicule. It was an experience so far beyond the scope of human imagination that it would provide the Quraysh with the ultimate weapon to destroy his credibility. Yet, harboring the absolute truth of his experience, Muhammad refused to stay silent. He walked into the public square and recounted the miraculous journey. The reaction of the Meccan elite was explosive. The Quraysh erupted in derisive laughter, openly mocking him in the streets. They seized upon the story as absolute proof of his madness, weaponizing the account to dissuade anyone teetering on the edge of conversion. They pointed at the sheer impossibility of crossing the desert to Jerusalem and returning before morning, treating the narrative as an absurd fantasy. The psychological pressure on the early Muslims was immense. Some new converts, their faith fragile, wavered under the relentless public humiliation. Sensing an opportunity to completely break the movement, the Quraysh approached Muhammad's closest friend, the wealthy and highly respected Abu Bakr. They relayed the seemingly impossible story, expecting the pragmatic merchant to finally realize the delusion of his leader. Instead, Abu Bakr's response sent a shockwave through the city. Without a trace of hesitation, he replied that if Muhammad said it was true, then he believed it absolutely. This staggering display of unyielding loyalty in the face of universal mockery earned Abu Bakr a title that would echo through history. *as-Siddiq*, the truthful. His absolute support fortified the believers, demonstrating that their faith was not contingent upon worldly logic, but on their unwavering trust in the Prophet. The night journey armed Muhammad with a profound internal resilience. It symbolically cemented the universality of Islam, proving it was a faith that honored the legacies of Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, transcending the narrow, tribal borders of Arabia. But while his spirit was fortified, his tactical reality remained dire. The hostility of Mecca had calcified into an impenetrable wall. The city of his birth would never serve as the cradle for the righteous, egalitarian society he was commanded to build. The Prophet realized with a heavy finality that in order for the message of Islam to survive, the Muslim community would have to abandon their homeland. They needed a sanctuary, but where in the unforgiving Arabian Peninsula could a persecuted minority find refuge? Roughly 200 miles, or 320 kilometers, to the north of Mecca lay a sprawling agricultural oasis city known as Yathrib. Unlike Mecca, which was a dense, highly centralized hub of international commerce controlled with an iron fist by the Quraysh, Yathrib was deeply fractured. The city was a volatile tinderbox, bleeding out from generations of incredibly violent tribal warfare. Two heavily armed, dominant Arab tribes, the Ors and the Khazraj, had been locked in a seemingly endless cycle of retaliatory clashes. The perpetual violence had decimated their populations, crippled their economy, and torn the very fabric of their society to shreds. The people of Yathrib were exhausted. The blood feuds had reached a point of absolute unsustainability. They desperately needed an arbitrator, a leader who possessed the wisdom, the impartiality, and the unquestionable moral authority to force a lasting peace upon the warring factions. In the ancient world, news traveled along the arteries of trade and pilgrimage. The whispers of a man in Mecca, a man who preached radical justice, who could not be bought by the Quraysh elite, and who claimed to speak for the one God, had begun to drift northward. During the sacred pilgrimage season, when violence was historically suspended, a small, weary contingent of men from Yathrib traveled south to Mecca. They were not looking for a new religion. They were looking for a way to stop their city from destroying itself. Amidst the massive, chaotic crowds circling the Kaaba, they sought out the man the Quraysh had tried so desperately to silence. When they found Muhammad, they sat in the dust and listened. He did not speak to them of tribal supremacy or political maneuvering. He spoke to them of a society engineered upon the pillars of ultimate compassion, strict justice, and an unwavering devotion to a single, unifying creator. To the men of Yathrib, whose entire lives had been defined by division and bloodshed, Muhammad's words were not just theological concepts. They were a blueprint for survival. Captivated by his profound vision of equality, the small delegation returned to the north. They carried with them a revolutionary spark, completely unaware that the message they were bringing back to their fractured, bleeding city would soon ignite a geopolitical shift that would alter the map of the world. The revolutionary spark, carried back from the sprawling sanctuary of Mecca, did not simply smolder in the agricultural oasis of Yathrib. It found a landscape profoundly desperate for ignition. For generations, the oasis city, located roughly 320 kilometers to the north of the Quraysh stronghold, had been trapped in a relentless, suffocating cycle of tribal warfare. The Ors and the Khazraj, the two dominant Arab factions of the region, had bled each other dry in retaliatory skirmishes that turned the fertile date palm groves into brutal battlefields. The societal fabric of Yathrib was completely shredded, leaving its people exhausted, deeply traumatized, and searching the horizon for an impartial leader who could mend their fractured world. The small delegation of men who had journeyed to the pilgrimage and sat in the dust to listen to the persecuted prophet returned to this bleeding city carrying an incredibly potent remedy. They did not bring back weapons, nor did they bring back wealth. They brought back a completely new ideological paradigm. They spoke passionately to their kin of a revolutionary vision for a society engineered upon the unshakable pillars of universal compassion, strict justice, and total submission to a single, unifying creator. In the suffocating atmosphere of Yathrib's perpetual vengeance, Muhammad's call for ultimate equality and mercy resonated with a staggering, undeniable power. It was not merely theology, it was a desperately needed political and social lifeline. A year after that initial, fateful encounter, the magnetic pull of this new faith drew a larger delegation southward. 12 men from Yathrib secretly navigated the treacherous routes to Mecca during the pilgrimage season, seeking the Prophet's direct guidance. In the shadowed, secluded valleys of Aqaba, far from the prying, hostile eyes of the Quraysh elites, they knelt and swore a solemn oath. This monumental event will be etched into history as the first pledge of Aqaba. It was a beautifully austere moral contract. The men of Yathrib pledged absolute devotion to the one God. They swore an oath to abandon the rampant theft, deceit, and adultery that plagued their era, and to uphold an uncompromising standard of moral integrity. Recognizing the profound potential of this northern foothold, Muhammad made a strategic and visionary decision. He dispatched one of his most trusted and eloquent companions, Mus'ab ibn Umair, to accompany the men back to the oasis. Mus'ab's mission was clear. He was to act as the primary ambassador of Islam, teaching the divine verses of the Quran and carefully laying the ideological foundation for a new society. Over the following months, Mus'ab's presence in Yathrib proved transformative. The message of Islam flowed through the alleyways and agricultural estates, quietly softening hardened hearts and bridging the ancient, blood-soaked divides between the Ors and the Khazraj. The momentum of the movement swelled with an unprecedented, peaceful velocity. The people of Yathrib, watching their fractured community slowly knit itself back together under the banner of monotheism, recognized that Muhammad was the unifying architect they had spent generations waiting for. The following year, the sheer scale of the demographic shift became undeniably apparent. A much larger, highly organized group of approximately 70 men and women from Yathrib embarked on the perilous journey to Mecca. Once again, under the cloak of night, they slipped past the Quraysh patrols and met the Prophet in utter secrecy at Aqaba. But this gathering was fundamentally different from the first. The stakes had been astronomically elevated. The second pledge of Aqaba was not merely an affirmation of spiritual devotion. It was a formidable, ironclad political and military alliance. The delegation from Yathrib looked at the persecuted Prophet and offered him the ultimate guarantee, absolute sanctuary. They swore an oath of unyielding loyalty, promising to absorb the Meccan Muslims into their own kin network and to defend Muhammad with their lives, their wealth, and their swords, just as they would protect their own families. This clandestine pact was a seismic turning point in the trajectory of human history. After more than a decade of horrific persecution, starvation, and public humiliation, the besieged Muslim community finally possessed a geographical haven. Yathrib offered an unprecedented opportunity, the chance to transition from a hunted religious minority into an independent, self-governing society, aligned with divine principles. For the believers enduring the suffocating cruelty of Mecca, the second pledge was nothing short of a miraculous intervention. But the geopolitical landscape of the Arabian Peninsula was a highly sensitive web, and a tremor of this magnitude could not remain hidden indefinitely. The intricate spy networks of the Quraysh eventually caught wind of the midnight pacts at Aqaba, and a wave of absolute panic swept through the Meccan elite. The Quraysh leadership instantly recognized the terrifying implications of the Yathrib alliance. If Muhammad and his intensely loyal followers were allowed to successfully migrate to a heavily fortified oasis directly to their north, the dynamic of power would instantly invert. Yathrib sat directly astride the primary northern trade routes connecting Mecca to the vast wealth of Syria. An independent Muslim stronghold in Yathrib would not merely provide a sanctuary for their theological enemies. It would grant Muhammad the strategic leverage to completely choke off the economic lifeblood of the Quraysh Empire. The threat was no longer just spiritual. It was an existential economic catastrophe waiting to happen. Fear morphed rapidly into a cold, calculated ruthlessness. The most powerful clan leaders of Mecca convened an emergency council, determined to permanently extinguish the threat before the Prophet could slip through their fingers. They knew that simply murdering Muhammad in the streets would instantly trigger a massive, apocalyptic blood feud with his fierce and proud clan, the Banu Hashim. They needed a method of execution that would dilute the guilt and paralyze any attempt at retaliation. From the shadows of the council, a brilliant, sinister solution was born. The Quraysh decided to assemble an elite hit squad. They would select one highly skilled, armed warrior from every major tribe in Mecca. Under the cover of total darkness, this coalition of assassins would simultaneously breach Muhammad's home and strike him down together. By spreading the blood of the Prophet across every powerful family in the city, the Banu Hashim would be mathematically and militarily incapable of seeking revenge. The perfect, politically impenetrable murder had been authorized. The night of the assassination was set. The arid wind howled through the labyrinthine streets of Mecca as the chosen killers, their blades sharpened and their faces veiled, silently converged on the Prophet's modest home, waiting for the cover of deepest sleep to strike. But the architects of this murder failed to account for a power far greater than their tribal politics. Guided by profound divine insight, Muhammad was fully aware of the assassins lurking just beyond his walls. The tension inside the small, dark house was palpable. The executioners were literally at the door. There was no time for panic, only for a deeply courageous, highly dangerous decoy operation. Muhammad turned to his young, fiercely devoted cousin, Ali. In an act of unparalleled, staggering bravery, Ali agreed to wrap himself in the Prophet's distinctive green cloak and lie down in his bed. Ali fully understood that when the assassins breached the door, their blades would be aimed directly at his chest. He was offering his life to buy the Prophet a window of escape. While the assassins peered through the cracks of the door, their eyes fixed on the shrouded figure they believed to be their target, Muhammad engaged in a miraculous, silent departure. Accompanied by his closest confidant, Abu Bakr, the Prophet slipped out of the house, bypassing the heavily armed death squad completely undetected. They vanished into the suffocating darkness of the Meccan night, embarking on the legendary journey that would forever be known as the Hira. The departure was not a comfortable exodus. It was a desperate, high-stakes manhunt. The moment the Quraysh breached the house and tore back the cloak to reveal a defiant Ali, the city erupted in fury. Realizing they had been thoroughly outmaneuvered, the Meccan elite dispatched heavily armed patrols and expert Bedouin trackers to scour every grain of sand leading north toward Yathrib. Knowing the main roads would be heavily surveilled, Muhammad and Abu Bakr did not immediately head north. In a brilliant tactical misdirection, they moved south, scaling the jagged, treacherous slopes of a mountain to seek refuge in the cramped, claustrophobic darkness of the Cave of Hira. For 3 agonizing, breathless days, the two men hid in the mountain's rocky belly while the full might of the Quraysh search parties combed the landscape. The tension reached an absolute fever pitch when a squad of Meccan trackers, following the footprints in the dust, arrived at the very precipice of the cave. Inside the suffocating dark, Abu Bakr could hear the sharp crunch of the trackers' boots on the gravel. He could hear their frustrated, angry voices echoing just inches from the cave's opening. The proximity of death was absolute. A single glance inside would mean immediate execution. Gripped by overwhelming anxiety, not for his own life, but for the survival of the Prophet and the entire message of Islam, Abu Bakr whispered his terror in the dark. But Muhammad, sitting in the absolute shadow of the blade, did not waver. His voice, calm and vibrating with an unshakable cosmic certainty, pierced the fear. "Do not be afraid. The prophet reassured his trembling friend, "God is with us." And miraculously, the hunters did not look inside. Tradition holds that divine intervention manifested through the humblest of creatures. A spider had woven an intricate, delicate web completely across the jagged entrance of the cave, and a wild pigeon had built a nest on the ledge, resting undisturbed. To the highly pragmatic Meccan trackers, the untouched web and the nesting bird were absolute proof that no human being had entered the cavern in weeks. Believing the cave to be empty, the hunters turned their backs and walked away, completely unaware that the architect of a New World empire was breathing quietly just feet away. Their faith remained gloriously unshaken. After the initial fury of the manhunt subsided and the desert roads grew quiet, Muhammad and Abu Bakr emerged from the mountain, secured a trusted guide, and began the grueling, punishing journey northward. The Hira was not merely a physical relocation of a persecuted minority. It was the definitive threshold of a new global epoch. When the weary, dust-covered prophet finally arrived on the outskirts of Yathrib, the reception was unlike anything the Arabian Peninsula had ever witnessed. The fractured, war-torn city poured out into the streets to welcome him with open arms and overwhelming joy. The residents of the oasis proudly took on a new identity, calling themselves the Ansar, the helpers. They opened their homes, their wealth, and their hearts to the destitute Meccan refugees, who became known as the Muhajirin, the immigrants. This incredible, unprecedented display of massive civic solidarity laid the absolute bedrock for the very first independent Muslim community. It was a society engineered not upon the ancient, rigid parameters of bloodlines and tribal supremacy, but completely upon the values of mutual cooperation, deep empathy, and shared ideological conviction. In honor of this monumental transition, the city of Yathrib would eventually shed its ancient name. It was rechristened Medina al-Munawwara, the Radiant City. It was here, in the sun-drenched, protective embrace of Medina, that the abstract theological teachings of Islam would finally be given the breathing room to materialize into concrete social, economic, and political systems. The Hira was an event of such staggering historical gravity that it would forever mark the beginning of the Islamic calendar. It represented the ultimate triumph of unbreakable faith over paralyzing fear, the victory of transcendent unity over tribal division, and the profound manifestation of a society that would soon rise to inspire, challenge, and completely reshape the foundations of the known world. The era of survival had officially ended. The era of building had begun. The transition from the scorched, hostile valleys of Mecca to the lush, sprawling agricultural oasis of Medina marked a profound psychological and geographical fracture in the history of the early Muslim community. For over a decade, the believers had existed in a state of perpetual, suffocating hypervigilance, their lives dictated by the terrifying whims of the Quraysh elite. They had been starved, publicly humiliated, tortured beneath the desert sun, and ultimately hunted through the treacherous mountain passes. But as the dust of the Hira settled, the refugees found themselves standing beneath the cooling shade of Medina's date palm groves, breathing air that was finally free from the imminent threat of execution. The era of sheer, desperate survival had closed, but an infinitely more complex chapter was about to tear open. Muhammad was no longer merely a persecuted spiritual visionary, delivering divine recitations in secret. Overnight, he had become the chief architect, diplomat, and supreme executive of an entirely new civilization. The demographic reality of Medina was a volatile, highly combustible puzzle. The city was not a unified metropolis, but a patchwork of vastly different communities holding deep-seated historical grievances and distinct cultural identities. There were the Ansar, the native helpers of Medina who had graciously opened their city. There were the Muhajirin, the traumatized and entirely destitute immigrants from Mecca who had arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. and there were powerful, deeply entrenched Jewish tribes who had resided in the oasis for generations, alongside smaller factions adhering to various other localized beliefs. To simply exist in the same geographical space was a recipe for eventual disaster. Muhammad inherently understood that if this fragile sanctuary was to survive the inevitable wrath of the Quraysh, these deeply divided groups required a unifying, unbreakable framework. He needed to engineer a revolutionary methodology for them to coexist harmoniously, completely preserving their individual identities while forging a singular, impenetrable civic loyalty. The physical manifestation of this new society began not with a grand fortress or a towering monument to military triumph, but with the mixing of simple, unbaked clay. Muhammad's absolute first priority upon arriving in the radiant city was to establish a physical and spiritual epicenter for the believers. On a specific plot of land, meticulously chosen by the Prophet himself, the community began the grueling, communal labor of constructing an incredibly humble sanctuary. This structure, built from mud brick and roofed with the rough trunks and fronds of palm trees, became known as Masjid al-Nabawi, the Prophet's mosque. To view it strictly as a place of religious ritual is to misunderstand its profound historical gravity. The Prophet's mosque was the pulsating, vibrant nerve center of the entire Medinan experiment. It was an architectural testament to extreme humility, completely devoid of the ostentatious wealth that defined the Kaaba in Mecca. Yet, within its incredibly modest earthen walls, the future of the Arabian Peninsula was forged. It served simultaneously as a house of intense spiritual devotion, a vibrant educational academy, a political parliament where community disputes were settled with absolute fairness, and a social refuge where the destitute could find shelter and a shared meal. The community gathered there constantly, learning directly from Muhammad, debating the logistics of their new society, and weaving the social fabric of an emerging empire from the dirt up. However, a beautiful communal space could not solve the immediate, crushing economic crisis that threatened to fracture the Muslims from within. The Muhajirun, the refugees from Mecca, were traditionally a people of commerce, trade, and urban enterprise. They had abandoned their vast fortunes, their established caravan routes, and their ancestral homes to follow the Prophet, arriving in Medina entirely penniless. Medina, conversely, was an agricultural economy, driven by the cultivation of vast date orchards and complex irrigation systems. The Meccans possessed neither the land, the capital, nor the specialized agricultural skills to survive in this new environment. Under normal historical circumstances, an influx of destitute, unskilled refugees would instantly collapse a local economy, breeding fierce resentment and inevitable civil conflict. To avert this looming catastrophe, Muhammad instituted an initiative of sociological alchemy so radical and unprecedented that it completely dismantled the ancient Arabian paradigms of blood and lineage. He enacted a legally binding, intensely emotional social pact known as ***, or brotherhood. This was not a mere symbolic gesture of friendship or a superficial political alliance. The Prophet systematically paired one destitute Meccan immigrant directly with one established Medinan helper, decreeing them to be brothers in the absolute truest sense of the word, their bond recognized as transcending even biological bloodlines. The staggering generosity required by this pact is difficult to comprehend through a modern lens. The Ansar, driven by an unshakable devotion to the message of Islam, physically divided their wealth, their agricultural resources, their food stockpiles, and even their homes, handing half of everything they owned to absolute strangers from Mecca. This initiative instantly integrated the refugees into the economic heartbeat of the city, staving off mass starvation and homelessness. But more importantly, the **** served as a brilliant, profound demonstration of faith in action. permanently obliterating the tribal supremacy that had plagued Arabia for centuries, and replacing it with a fiercely loyal, incredibly resilient community, bound exclusively by shared belief. With the internal cohesion of the Muslims secured, Muhammad turned his brilliant strategic mind to the external geopolitical tightrope of Medina. The Muslims were not the only heavily armed demographic within the oasis. The powerful Jewish tribes and various other native groups held significant military and economic influence. If the Quraysh of Mecca decided to march north and lay siege to the city, internal division would lead to a rapid, bloody slaughter. To neutralize this threat, Muhammad drafted what is widely considered by historians to be one of the most astonishing, groundbreaking political documents of the ancient world, the Constitution of Medina. This monumental social contract was an absolute masterclass in pluralistic governance. It formally outlined the explicit rights, duties, and reciprocal responsibilities of every single citizen in the oasis, officially uniting the Muslims, the Jewish tribes, and the non-Muslim Arabs under a single, unified civic umbrella. The Constitution guaranteed absolute religious freedom, explicitly stating that each distinct group was entirely free to practice its own faith without fear of coercion or persecution. But in exchange for this autonomy, the document demanded absolute civic loyalty. It stipulated that all factions were bound by a sacred duty to mutually defend Medina against any external threat, to share the financial burdens of war, and to function as a single, impenetrable unit in times of conflict. Furthermore, the Constitution revolutionized the concept of justice. It strictly declared that no individual was permitted to harm another without just, legal cause, completely outlawing the ancient, chaotic tradition of tribal blood feuds. Disputes were no longer to be settled by the edge of a sword in the dead of night. They were to be brought forward and adjudicated fairly, establishing a framework of mutual respect and an absolute rule of law that transcended tribal lineage. In a landscape historically defined by lawless violence, the Constitution of Medina laid the bedrock for a highly sophisticated, pluralistic society where religious diversity was respected and justice was held as the supreme, unviolable standard. As the political and economic foundations of Medina rapidly solidified, the deeply immersive, daily spiritual rhythms of Islamic life began to completely permeate the atmosphere of the city. Muhammad's teachings moved beyond abstract theology, meticulously shaping the ethical, social, and spiritual conduct of his people. He ruthlessly attacked the concept of hoarded wealth, transforming the act of charity from a sporadic, voluntary kindness into an absolute, structural pillar of the society. Zakat, the mandatory giving of alms, was institutionalized, requiring the wealthier members of the community to systematically surrender a portion of their assets to directly support the most vulnerable, the poor, the orphans, the widows, and the destitute. This was not viewed as a tax, but as a profound moral duty, a spiritual purification of wealth, and a relentless commitment to an economy engineered on profound human compassion rather than relentless exploitation. The very auditory landscape of the oasis underwent a breathtaking transformation. In the chaotic, bustling markets of Mecca, the sounds of commerce and tribal boasting had reigned supreme. In Medina, Muhammad sought a method to unify the community, to halt the frantic machinery of daily life, and pull the believer's consciousness back to the divine. Thus, the the Islamic call to prayer, was introduced. 5 times a day, beginning in the quiet, pre-dawn darkness and ending beneath the canopy of stars, a rhythmic, deeply soulful human voice would echo across the rooftops and date palms, offering an incredibly beautiful, melodic invitation to commune with the Creator. This public, communal act of prayer became an unstoppable unifying force, a brilliant daily recalibration of the city's purpose, stripping away the ego of the individual and instilling a massive, collective sense of discipline, extreme humility, and overwhelming gratitude. At the center of this utopian transformation stood a leader who completely defied the traditional archetype of an absolute ruler. While the emperors of Byzantium and Persia draped themselves in suffocating layers of silk, gold, and untouchable grandeur, Muhammad operated as the ultimate servant of his people. He possessed the fierce, unconditional loyalty of an army that would gladly die for him, yet he lived in astonishing, intentional poverty. His home remained as incredibly modest and Spartan as the poorest of his followers, and he never hesitated to plunge his own hands into the dirt, working the soil, carrying bricks, and sharing the back-breaking daily tasks alongside his community. He was intensely approachable, listening to the deepest anxieties of his followers with profound empathy, treating everyone from the wealthiest merchant to the most destitute laborer with the exact same, unwavering dignity and respect. His actions were a living, breathing testament to the values he preached, forging a bond of spiritual affection so deep and personal that his followers revered him not out of fear, but out of an overwhelming, profound love. Medina was blossoming into an incredibly vibrant, self-sustaining sanctuary of justice, ethical commerce, and unbreakable faith. But utopias are rarely allowed to exist in a vacuum, especially when they threaten the geopolitical dominance of a neighboring superpower. 320 kilometers to the south, the absolute rulers of Mecca were watching the astonishing rise of Medina with a cold, blinding terror. The Quraysh had assumed that driving Muhammad into the unforgiving desert would completely extinguish his movement. Instead, their persecution had accidentally handed him a fertile, highly strategic kingdom. The intelligence networks arriving in Mecca painted a terrifying picture. Muhammad was not just surviving. He was rapidly amassing power, consolidating diverse tribes, and forging a highly disciplined, intensely loyal society stationed directly alongside the critical northern trade routes that the Quraysh desperately relied upon to maintain their immense wealth. The Meccan elite realized with a sinking dread that their economic dominance, their religious authority over the Arabian Peninsula, and their very survival were now under severe, imminent threat. The distance between the two cities did nothing to cool the simmering, venomous hatred of the Quraysh. They began to launch a vicious campaign of psychological warfare, dispatching heavily armed envoys and terrifying, explicit threats to the people of Medina, warning them of absolute annihilation and dire, bloody consequences if they continue to shelter the Prophet and support his rapidly expanding faith. A dark, incredibly heavy shadow began to stretch across the sunlit date groves of the radiant city. Muhammad, whose deepest, most profound preference was always for peace, understood the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of the ancient world. He took a deeply cautious, yet remarkably firm stance. He recognized that Medina was no longer just a physical location. It was the sole surviving sanctuary of a faith built on justice, and protecting it was now the absolute highest spiritual and social responsibility of every man and woman within its borders. He ordered his followers to remain intensely vigilant, to post sentries at the edges of the oasis, and to prepare their minds and bodies for the harsh reality that was rapidly accelerating toward them. The idyllic era of peaceful community building was about to be violently interrupted. The forces of the old world were mobilizing their wealth, their armor, and their rage. A catastrophic collision was no longer a distant possibility. It was an absolute, terrifying certainty, and the very first drop of blood was about to permanently stain the desert sands. The humiliating defeat at the wells of Badr did not induce surrender within the Meccan elite. It incubated a spectacular, venomous obsession within the opulent courtyards of the Quraysh. Grief instantly metamorphosed into a cold, heavily financed industry of vengeance. To ensure their supremacy would never again be challenged by the exiles of Medina, the aristocracy liquidated immense portions of their trading wealth to construct an unstoppable military juggernaut. Within a single year, they managed to assemble a terrifying force of 3,000 heavily armed soldiers, an army completely dwarfing the one that had been broken at Badr by a magnitude of 3. This was not a hastily gathered militia. It was a highly organized instrument of total war, bristling with newly forged weaponry, a lethal corps of mounted archers, and an absolute abundance of logistical supplies, funded entirely by the staggering wealth of the Meccan trade monopolies. At the absolute vanguard of this massive force rode Abu Sufyan. As one of the most powerful and deeply influential figures in all of Mecca, his motivations transcended mere geopolitical strategy. He was driven by a blinding, deeply personal vendetta against the Prophet and the movement that had humiliated his city. The objective of this campaign was brutally singular. They would march north, break the gates of Medina, and obliterate the Muslim community from the annals of history once and for all. As the thunder of 3,000 marching men and the dust of a massive cavalry advance began to roll across the desert toward the radiant city, the intelligence networks of Medina sounded the alarm. The Muslims realized with a chilling certainty that the storm they had feared was finally upon them. Inside the earthen walls of the Prophet's mosque, a tense, highly critical war council was convened. Muhammad, steadfast in his commitment to consultative leadership, sought the direct counsel of his followers on how to counter this apocalyptic threat. The room was sharply divided along generational lines. The older, highly seasoned companions of the Prophet strongly advocated for a defensive posture, urging the community to barricade themselves within the dense, maze-like alleyways of Medina, leveraging the city's architecture to neutralize the Meccan cavalry and force a grueling urban siege. However, the younger generation of Muslims, their blood still burning with the intoxicating adrenaline of their miraculous triumph at Badr, were fiercely opposed to hiding behind walls. They passionately demanded the right to march out into the open desert and meet the Quraysh face to face, eager for another opportunity to prove their unshakable faith and martial prowess. After carefully weighing the arguments and engaging in deep prayer, Muhammad made a fateful concession. He aligned with the impassioned majority, making the incredibly bold decision to lead his men out of the city limits to confront the massive Meccan war machine in open combat. The theater chosen for this monumental collision was Mount Uhud, a jagged, incredibly rugged expanse of uneven, rocky terrain situated just to the north of Medina. The mathematical reality of the battlefield was staggering. Muhammad marched out to the shadow of the mountain with an army of only 700 men. They were facing a force more than 4 times their size. Recognizing the devastating potential of the Meccan cavalry, Muhammad engineered a brilliant, highly specific tactical defense utilizing the natural topography of Uhud. He meticulously positioned his heavily outnumbered infantry with their backs to the sheer face of the mountain, preventing the Quraysh from enveloping them. But the absolute linchpin of his strategy rested upon a small, elevated geographical feature flanking their position. Here, the Prophet stationed a specialized unit of 50 skilled archers. Their orders were absolute, delivered with a terrifying clarity. They were to hold this high ground and guard the vulnerable rear of the Muslim infantry from any sweeping cavalry flank attacks. Under no circumstances, Muhammad commanded, were they to abandon this hill. Whether the Muslim army was achieving a glorious victory or suffering a horrific slaughter, the archers were to remain anchored to that rock. When the two armies finally collided beneath the shadow of Uhud, the sheer, explosive violence of the encounter shook the valley. Despite the overwhelming, crushing numerical superiority of the Quraysh, the initial phase of the battle mirrored the miraculous impossibility of Badr. Fighting with a ferocious, unbreakable courage, The small Muslim infantry absorbed the massive Meccan charge and pushed back. With astonishing skill and desperate momentum, the believers began to systematically dismantle the heavily armored front lines of their oppressors, gaining a decisive, bloody upper hand. The shock of this fierce resistance completely shattered the psychological resolve of the Quraysh. Their heavily disciplined ranks began to crack, splinter, and ultimately break entirely. As panic rippled through the Meccan lines, soldiers began to drop their weapons, abandoning their vast, expensive supplies in the dirt as they turned and fled from the astonishing fury of the vastly outnumbered Muslims. Victory, seemingly impossible just hours before, was shimmering within reach, but the crucible of war is entirely unforgiving of human frailty. Standing atop the crucial flanking hill, the unit of 50 archers watched the Meccan lines disintegrate. They watched their brothers surging forward, actively pursuing the fleeing enemy and beginning to collect the incredibly valuable spoils of war left scattered across the blood-soaked sand. A fatal, catastrophic miscalculation took root in their minds, believing the battle was definitively won and the enemy completely broken. The overwhelming temptation of the abandoned wealth proved too great. In direct, tragic violation of the Prophet's absolute command to hold their ground at all costs, a significant portion of the archers broke discipline. They scrambled down the slopes of the hill, abandoning their critical post to join the chaotic scramble for the spoils of war. They left the rear of the Muslim army completely naked. Watching from the chaotic periphery of the retreating Meccan forces was a man whose name would become synonymous with tactical genius and terrifying lethality: Khalid ibn al-Walid. Commanding the elite Quraysh cavalry, Khalid instantly recognized the fatal error. The hill was unguarded. With ruthless, terrifying precision, Khalid rallied his horsemen, executing a massive, sweeping maneuver that circled entirely around the jagged rocks. Like a devastating tidal wave of steel and hooves, the Meccan cavalry crashed directly into the completely unprotected, exposed flank of the celebrating Muslim army. The sudden, catastrophic onslaught instantly evaporated the Muslim momentum. The hunters were suddenly the hunted. The fleeing Meccan infantry, seeing Khalid's brilliant, devastating counterattack, immediately halted their retreat, aggressively regrouping to launch a massive, renewed offensive. The Muslim forces, caught entirely off guard and trapped in a brutal pincer movement, were thrown into absolute, blinding disarray. The structured lines of defense dissolved into a chaotic, desperate slaughter. Amidst the swirling dust, the screams of horses, and the deafening crash of weaponry, sheer panic gripped the believers. In the horrifying epicenter of this chaos, a nightmare materialized. The Prophet Muhammad was physically struck by a barrage of heavy stones and swinging weapons. Bleeding and severely injured, the architect of Medina fell to the earth. Through the blood-choked air of the battlefield, a terrifying, paralyzing rumor rapidly swept through the disoriented Muslim ranks. The Prophet had been killed. For a community whose entire existence was tethered to this single man, the psychological impact of this rumor was utterly devastating. The news acted like poison, shattering the remaining resolve of the army and causing portions of the Muslim force to drop their swords and flee the battlefield in absolute hollow despair. But the Prophet was not dead. Dragging himself up from the dirt, his face bleeding and his armor battered, Muhammad desperately managed to regroup. Seeing his survival, a fiercely loyal, impenetrable core of his closest companions, including Ali, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Talha, violently carved their way through the Meccan slaughter to reach him. They formed a living, heavily armored shield around the injured Prophet, creating an unbroken protective circle of steel and flesh. Fighting with unimaginable ferocity, this tight perimeter slowly, agonizingly fought a retreating action, dragging the Prophet backward to the tactical safety of the higher, defensible ground on the slopes of Mount Uhud. The unshakable courage of this small, bloodied inner circle acted as a desperate beacon in the chaos, inspiring the remaining terrified Muslims to violently rally and hold their position against the advancing Quraysh. The Battle of Uhud concluded not with a definitive annihilation, but with a heavy, agonizing stalemate. The Quraysh, having successfully halted the Muslim advance, inflicted massive casualties and severely wounded the Prophet, felt their brutal objective had been largely met. Lacking a clear, strategic path to safely besiege and capture the fortified city of Medina itself, Abu Sufyan and the Meccan leadership chose to withdraw, leaving the blood-soaked slopes behind and beginning the long march back to Mecca. When the dust finally settled over the jagged rocks of Uhud, the sheer scale of the tragedy was fully revealed. It was a crippling, devastating blow. 70 Muslim men lay dead, their blood watering the arid earth. These were not merely soldiers. They were the closest, most intensely beloved companions of the Prophet. Among the fallen was Hamza, Muhammad's fiercely protective uncle, the great warrior who had been instrumental in the miraculous victory at Badr. His death was a profound, deeply personal agony for the Prophet, made infinitely worse by the horrifying reality of the ancient battlefield. In a gruesome display of absolute tribal vengeance, Hamza's body was deliberately desecrated by Hind bint Utbah, the wife of Abu Sufyan, who sought a visceral, bloody retribution for the kin she had lost to Hamza's blade at Badr. The march back to Medina was suffocatingly quiet. The community was broken, grieving, and forced to swallow a harsh, incredibly bitter lesson. The catastrophic reversal of fortune was not a failure of faith, but a deeply human failure of discipline, unity, and absolute trust in leadership. The instantaneous decision of a few archers to abandon their posts for the allure of material wealth had exposed the entire civilization to near annihilation, turning a moment of glorious triumph into an incredibly costly, deeply traumatic setback. In the heavy, mourning-filled aftermath, Muhammad gathered the weeping community. He did not berate them with anger. Instead, he carefully emphasized the profound spiritual significance of their agonizing sacrifice. He reminded the broken families that those who had fallen at Uhud had not died in vain, but had perished for an incredibly noble cause, giving their lives to defend the very existence of their faith and their sanctuary. To anchor their shattered hearts, new verses of the Quran were revealed, offering profound solace and a complex, highly essential guidance. The divine words forced the Muslims to confront their own weaknesses, encouraging them to find an unshakable strength in their adversity. The tragedy at Uhud was framed not as a divine abandonment, but as an incredibly humbling, necessary experience. It taught them that ultimate victory was never guaranteed by faith alone. It required absolute obedience, ironclad discipline, and an unwavering, unbreakable patience in the face of terror. For Muhammad, the blood spilled on the mountain underscored the immense, terrifying challenges that still lay ahead. The losses forged an even harder steel within his resolve. He understood that to survive in this ruthless landscape, his followers could no longer afford the smallest fracture in their unity. They had to learn from the catastrophe, to bind their wounds, and to prepare themselves for the reality that the Quraysh were not finished. The struggle for their absolute right to exist was far from over. The bitter lessons carved into the rocky slopes of Mount Uhud fundamentally transformed the psychological architecture of Medina. The Muslim community had stared directly into the abyss of their own annihilation, learning through the agony of a near-fatal defeat that absolute discipline and unbroken unity were the only true currencies of survival. But the Quraysh of Mecca had also learned a terrifying lesson. They had marched out to slaughter the Muslims, yet had failed to extinguish the movement. They realized that independent, isolated skirmishes would never be enough to break the iron will of the exiled prophet. If Medina was to be destroyed, it would require a geopolitical mobilization on a scale never before witnessed in the history of the Arabian Peninsula. Driven by an absolute, consuming obsession to erase Islam from the map, the Meccan elite initiated a massive diplomatic offensive. They dispatched heavily funded envoys across the blistering deserts, rallying distant, independent nomadic tribes, forging complex, highly lucrative alliances, and binding the disparate factions of Arabia under a single, unified banner of extermination. By the year 627 CE, the terrifying culmination of this dark diplomacy materialized. An apocalyptic coalition had been formed. 10,000 heavily armed warriors, an army of unprecedented, staggering magnitude in Arabian warfare, began the slow, earth-shaking march northward toward the radiant city. To understand the sheer terror of this moment, one must comprehend the mathematical reality of the era. The entire population of Medina, including women, children, and the elderly, was a mere fraction of the invading force, with the actual fighting strength of the Muslims numbering fewer than 3,000 men. An army of 10,000 was not merely a military threat, it was an extinction-level event. The sheer logistical footprint of the Quraysh coalition was designed to overwhelm, to suffocate, and to completely crush the oasis under the weight of sheer numbers. When the scouts galloped into Medina, their horses lathered in sweat. Carrying the horrifying intelligence of the approaching Leviathan, the city was plunged into a state of supreme emergency. Muhammad, completely refusing to succumb to the paralyzing panic that gripped the populace, immediately convened his war council. The tactical situation was desperately grim. The coalition's explicit strategy was to launch a massive, overwhelming direct assault, utilizing their vast cavalry to smash through the Muslim lines in open combat. Medina possessed a unique, naturally defensive topography. The eastern, western, and southern approaches to the oasis were choked by dense, impenetrable volcanic lava fields and thick networks of date palms, making a coordinated massive cavalry charge from those directions physically impossible. However, the northern approach was a wide, exposed, completely vulnerable expanse of open terrain. It was a massive, geographical open door, and the 10,000 warriors of the Quraysh were marching directly toward it. As the council desperately debated traditional Arabian tactics, a voice of profound, highly unconventional wisdom spoke up. It belonged to Salman al-Farsi, a man whose incredible spiritual journey had carried him from the distant, highly sophisticated Sassanid Empire of Persia to the sands of Arabia. Salman understood that fighting a vastly superior force in open combat was suicide. He proposed a breathtakingly innovative, completely alien defensive stratagem. They must engineer the earth itself into a weapon. He suggested digging a massive, impassable trench directly across the entire exposed northern vulnerability of the city. In the long, bloody history of Arabian warfare, which relied almost exclusively on the speed of the horse, the shock of the cavalry charge, and the fluidity of desert raiding, a fixed, deeply engineered fortification like a trench was entirely unheard of. It was a radical paradigm shift. Muhammad, recognizing the absolute brilliance of the Persians' proposal, immediately ratified the plan. What followed was one of the most astonishing displays of communal endurance in human history. The coalition was days away. The massive chasm had to be excavated entirely by hand, carving through dense, unforgiving earth and stubborn layers of volcanic rock. The entire Muslim community mobilized with a terrifying, absolute urgency. Men, women, and children descended upon the northern perimeter, armed with whatever primitive pickaxes, shovels, and baskets they could find. The labor was grueling beyond comprehension. The sun baked the workers by day, and the freezing desert winds crippled them by night. Rations completely dwindled, and the community was forced to perform backbreaking labor on empty stomachs, binding stones tightly to their waists to suppress the agonizing physical pangs of starvation. Their hands blistered, split, and bled into the soil. Yet, amidst the exhaustion and the creeping shadow of the approaching army, the morale did not shatter. Muhammad himself descended into the deepest, most treacherous sections of the excavation. He swung the pickaxe alongside his poorest followers, his face covered in the same choking white dust, his clothes stained with the same sweat and dirt, singing verses of faith to maintain the rhythmic, desperate pace of the digging. The monumental earthwork was completed just as the terrifying, massive dust cloud of the Quraysh coalition darkened the horizon. When the vanguard of the 10,000-strong army arrived at the northern edge of Medina, expecting a swift, bloody slaughter, they were brought to an absolute, highly confused halt. Stretching across the entire vulnerable expanse of the city was a deep, wide, masterfully engineered chasm. The Meccan cavalry, the absolute pride and primary weapon of the Quraysh, was completely neutralized. Horses could not jump it. Men could not quickly scale the sheer walls, while under a barrage of Muslim arrows from the opposite bank. The shock of this alien tactic completely derailed the highly arrogant, aggressive momentum of the coalition. The brilliant, orthodox strategy of the Persian had instantly transformed an open slaughter into a grinding, highly complex siege. The Battle of the Trench, the Khandak, was not defined by the dramatic clash of steel, but by a suffocating, deeply psychological war of attrition. The massive Quraysh coalition set up camp on the far side of the chasm, launching relentless volleys of arrows and attempting desperately to discover a weak point in the defense. Days agonizingly bled into weeks. The strain of the prolonged standoff began to severely erode the sanity of both sides. For the Muslims, the physical conditions inside the besieged city were deteriorating into an absolute nightmare. Food supplies were exhausted. The harsh, biting cold of the winter desert nights seeped into their bones. But the most terrifying threat was not the 10,000 men massed beyond the trench. It was the chilling, highly volatile reality brewing directly behind the Muslim lines. Within the southern perimeters of Medina resided the Banu Qurayza, a powerful, heavily fortified Jewish tribe. Initially, they had remained neutral, technically bound by the supreme, pluralistic agreement forged in the Constitution of Medina to protect the city from external invaders. However, as the terrifying siege dragged on, and the sheer, overwhelming size of the Meccan coalition seemed to guarantee the ultimate destruction of Muhammad's community, intense pressure was applied to the Banu Qurayza leadership. Envoys from the Quraysh infiltrated the oasis, offering lucrative terms and manipulating the tribal leaders, promising that if they turned on the Muslims from within, they would share in the ultimate triumph. Torn by the incredibly precarious geopolitical reality, elements within the Banu Qurayza eventually succumbed to the diplomatic pressure and began secretly collaborating with the Meccan coalition, effectively breaching the absolute non-aggression pact of the Constitution. When the intelligence of this treason reached the Muslim ranks at the trench, the psychological blow was catastrophic. The believers were suddenly trapped in a terrifying two-front vice. They were desperately holding off an army of 10,000 to the north, while their southern flank was entirely exposed to an internal, heavily armed rebellion. Fear, paranoia, and a profound, agonizing anxiety swept through the exhausted defenders. Yet, even as the fabric of the city threatened to tear itself apart from within, the Muslims held the line. They patrolled the freezing trench through the darkest hours of the night, relying entirely on their unwavering trust in divine guidance. Verses of the Quran were revealed during these darkest, most terrifying hours, demanding unshakable steadfastness, reinforcing the spiritual concept that ultimate victory is often forged in the fires of extreme endurance and absolute patience. Then, when the siege had reached the absolute limits of human physical and psychological endurance, the atmosphere of the Arabian desert violently shifted. The sky bruised into a deep, terrifying purple. The temperature plummeted drastically. Without warning, a ferocious, apocalyptic winter hurricane swept across the valley, entirely bypassing the sheltered oasis of Medina and slamming directly into the exposed, sprawling encampment of the Quraysh coalition. The sheer violence of the storm was unearthly. Freezing, torrential rains flooded the arid ground. Icy, howling winds ripped the massive leather tents from their moorings, sending them violently tumbling into the darkness. Campfires were instantly extinguished, plunging the massive army into a freezing, terrifying, pitch-black chaos. Cooking vessels were overturned, horses broke their tethers and fled into the night, and a profound, supernatural terror gripped the hearts of the invaders. The coalition, already severely exhausted by weeks of an incredibly frustrating, completely ineffective siege, and suffering from rapidly dwindling supplies, completely broke under the wrath of the storm. The unity of the vast, disparate tribal alliance shattered. Demoralized, freezing, and utterly terrified, the mighty 10,000-strong army dissolved. Abu Sufyan, realizing that absolute disaster had struck, swallowed his blinding pride and ordered the immediate, total evacuation of the camp. Under the cover of the violent hurricane, the greatest military force Arabia had ever seen retreated back into the southern deserts in absolute, humiliating defeat. When the dawn light finally broke, casting its golden rays over the edge of the trench, the Muslims looked out across the chasm. The horizon, which had been choked with the terrifying mass of the enemy for nearly a month, was completely, perfectly empty. The battle of the trench was over. It was a victory achieved without a climactic clash of armies, won entirely through brilliant tactical engineering, immense communal resilience, and what the believers viewed as absolute, undeniable divine intervention. However, the geopolitical tectonic plates of the region had permanently shifted. The failure of the massive coalition unequivocally proved that the exiled refugees of Mecca had metamorphosed into an impenetrable, highly sophisticated power. The Quraysh had exhausted their ultimate military trump card, and they had failed. But the immediate aftermath of the siege was heavily shadowed by a somber, severe reality. The treason of the Banu Qurayza could not be ignored. In the ruthless, high-stakes environment of ancient Arabia, where a fractured alliance during a siege meant absolute extermination for every man, woman, and child, the internal betrayal had to be addressed. A tribunal was established to legally adjudicate the actions of the tribe, resulting in an outcome that reflected the incredibly harsh, severe realities of ancient warfare and the absolute, uncompromising necessity of civic loyalty in a besieged sanctuary. Despite the tragedy of the aftermath, the survival of the trench solidified Muhammad's standing as an unparalleled, highly capable geopolitical strategist. He had guided a vastly outnumbered, starving community through the darkest, most terrifying psychological crucible imaginable. The era of the Muslims merely bracing for the next attack had officially concluded. The balance of power in the Arabian Peninsula had tipped, and the Prophet's eyes now turned southward, toward the city that had cast him out, realizing that the ultimate path to victory would not be paved with swords, but with a highly unexpected, profoundly audacious stroke of diplomacy. For 6 grueling, blood-soaked years, the exiled Muslim community of Medina had existed within a terrifying crucible of survival. They had withstood assassinations, economic blockades, internal betrayals, and the unrelenting, apocalyptic fury of the Quraysh war machine. The miraculous defense of the trench had proven to the entire Arabian Peninsula that the believers could not be eradicated by sheer military force. They had forged a sophisticated, impregnable sanctuary out of an agricultural oasis. Yet, despite their astonishing geopolitical ascension, a profound, aching void lingered within the collective psyche of the Muhajirun, the immigrants who had fled Mecca. They were conquerors of adversity, but they were also a people suffering from a deeply entrenched, agonizing homesickness. They longed for the narrow, bustling streets of their youth, the familiar shadows of the surrounding mountains, and above all else, The Kaaba, the ancient, cubic sanctuary built by the patriarch Abraham, was the absolute spiritual epicenter of their universe. For over half a decade, they had turned their faces toward it 5 times a day in prayer, yet they were physically barred from its sacred precincts by the hostile elite who had stolen their homes and driven them into the desert. The pain of this spiritual exile was a heavy, suffocating weight. In the year 628 CE, recognizing the shifting tectonic plates of Arabian power and guided by a profound visionary resolve, Muhammad initiated a paradigm shift that would leave the military strategists of his era completely bewildered. He announced his intention to march on Mecca. However, this march was not designed as an act of violent retribution or an imperial conquest. He intended to approach the heavily fortified, deeply hostile headquarters of the Quraysh to perform the Umrah, the lesser pilgrimage. His strategy was breathtakingly audacious, relying on a psychological vulnerability rather than military strength. He commanded his followers to leave their heavy armor, their war horses, and their battle lances behind. They were to wrap themselves in the simple, unstitched white garments of the pilgrim, the ihram, a visual declaration of absolute vulnerability and spiritual purity. They would carry only the standard, light travelers' swords sheathed at their sides, permitted solely for basic self-defense against desert bandits, entirely insufficient for waging a war against a standing army. The Prophet was engineering a masterclass in ancient diplomacy. By approaching the sacred city during the holy months, entirely devoid of military posturing, he was forcing the Quraysh into an impossible geopolitical corner. If the Meccan elites allowed the Muslims to perform the rites, it would serve as an implicit, highly public acknowledgement of the Muslims' legitimacy and right to exist. If the Quraysh, who proudly styled themselves as the noble, honorable custodians of the Kaaba, violently slaughtered a peaceful caravan of unarmed pilgrims, they would completely incinerate their diplomatic credibility and invite the disgust of every independent tribe across the Arabian Peninsula. Approximately 1,400 Muslims volunteered for this terrifying journey. The sheer courage required to participate in this march is difficult to overstate. They were walking directly into the lion's den, fully aware that the men waiting for them in Mecca were the very same aristocrats who had tortured their families, confiscated their wealth, and actively sought their total extermination just months prior. Yet, bound by an unshakable trust in the Prophet's vision, this vast sea of white-clad pilgrims set out across the blistering dunes, their voices rising in a rhythmic, solemn chant of devotion, declaring their peaceful intentions to the barren sky. As the massive, peaceful procession approached the territorial outskirts of Mecca, the intelligence networks of the Quraysh delivered the news. The reaction within the opulent courtyards of the Meccan elite was one of absolute, blinding panic and frantic mobilization. The Quraysh were terrified. They refused to believe the march was purely spiritual, viewing the advancing column of 1,400 men as a brilliant, deceptive provocation. Paralyzed by the fear of losing their absolute authority, the leadership aggressively deployed their elite cavalry units to block the primary roads, determined to prevent the Prophet from setting foot inside the sacred limits of the city at any cost. When the forward scouts of the Muslim caravan reported the heavily armed Quraysh blockade, the tension in the desert air thickened into a suffocating pressure. A single drawn sword, a single nervous arrow, would instantly ignite a massacre. Muhammad, maintaining an absolute, unyielding commitment to his vision of a bloodless resolution, refused to engage the Meccan cavalry. Instead, utilizing his intimate knowledge of the treacherous local geography, he executed a highly complex tactical diversion. He guided his 1,400 followers off the main, heavily guarded arteries, navigating through brutal, unforgiving, and dangerously rugged terrain until they reached an obscure, sun-scorched depression on the very edge of the sacred boundary. This desolate, dusty settlement characterized by a scarce, nearly exhausted well, was known as Hudaybiyah. It was here, sitting in the blistering heat and choking dust, that the greatest diplomatic chess match of the early Islamic era would unfold. The standoff was excruciating. The Muslims were trapped in an incredibly hostile environment, their water supplies critically low, staring down the possibility of a massive Meccan assault to break the dangerous deadlock and officially communicate their peaceful intentions to the furious aristocracy of Mecca. Muhammad required an envoy of unparalleled diplomatic tact. He needed someone whose lineage commanded such immense respect within the city that even the most bloodthirsty elites would hesitate to harm him. He selected Uthman ibn Affan. Uthman was not only a remarkably early convert to Islam and a man of profound spiritual elegance, but he belonged to the powerful Umayyad clan, making him a direct relative of some of the most influential and dangerous power brokers within the Quraysh hierarchy. Uthman slipped past the blockade and vanished into the hostile labyrinth of Mecca to negotiate the right of pilgrimage. The Muslim camp at Hudaybiyah settled into a terrifying, agonizing vigil. The hours dragged into days. The blistering Arabian sun beat down upon the white garments of the pilgrims, and the silence from the city grew increasingly ominous. Then a dark, terrifying whisper began to snake its way through the encampment. The rumor was devastating in its absolute finality. The negotiations had failed, the diplomatic immunity of the envoy had been violently violated, and Uthman ibn Affan had been assassinated by the Quraysh. The shockwave that hit the Muslim camp instantly transformed the psychological atmosphere. The boundaries of peaceful diplomacy had seemingly been shattered. The murder of an ambassador in the ancient world was the ultimate, unforgivable declaration of total war. The 1,400 men, who had marched across the desert with hearts tuned to spiritual reflection, suddenly found themselves staring into the terrifying abyss of their own imminent destruction. They were trapped, unarmored, and vastly outgunned on the edge of enemy territory. In this moment of profound, existential crisis, Muhammad did not order a frantic, chaotic retreat. Instead, he positioned himself beneath the sparse, dappled shade of a solitary acacia tree rising from the dust of Hudaybiyah. He called his followers to him. What transpired beneath that tree is etched into the absolute bedrock of Islamic history as the Bayat al-Ridwan, the pledge of satisfaction. One by one, 1,400 men approached the Prophet. They reached out, placing their hands firmly over his, and swore an oath of terrifying, absolute finality. They pledged that if the rumor was true, they would not flee. They would draw their light traveling swords, they would march directly into the heavily armored ranks of the Quraysh, and they would fight to the absolute last drop of blood in defense of their prophet and their faith. This was not a pledge of victory. It was an acceptance of martyrdom. It was a profound, awe-inspiring demonstration of absolute, unbreakable unity. The psychological energy generated under that acacia tree was so immense that word of the believers' terrifying resolve quickly leaked back through the blockade and into the halls of the Meccan elite. The Quraysh leaders, realizing they were standing on the precipice of a bloodbath that would permanently stain their holy city, blinked. The rumor, as it turned out, was entirely false. Uthman emerged from the city completely unharmed, carrying with him the news that the Quraysh, deeply unnerved by the terrifying solidarity of the Muslims, were finally willing to negotiate a formal treaty. The Meccans dispatched Suhail ibn Amr, a brilliant, highly articulate, and deeply stubborn diplomat, to the dusty encampment at Hudaybiyah. The negotiations that followed were grueling, highly tense, and fraught with immense ideological friction. Every single word was a battleground. As the document was being physically drafted, the incredibly restrictive, highly controversial terms demanded by the Quraysh began to push the exhausted Muslims to the absolute brink of outrage. The conditions laid down by Suhail were overwhelmingly, seemingly entirely, in favor of Mecca. First, the Muslims would be strictly forbidden from entering the city to perform the pilgrimage that year. They would have to turn around, march back to Medina in perceived humiliation, and return the following year for a strictly limited, highly monitored window of 3 days. Second, a sweeping 10-year military truce would be established, forbidding any acts of war or raiding between Medina and Mecca. But the final clause was the most agonizingly difficult for the believers to swallow. It was an entirely unbalanced, highly biased extradition agreement. The treaty stipulated that if any individual from Mecca fled to Medina and converted to Islam without the permission of their tribal guardian, the Muslims were legally obligated to forcefully return that refugee to the Quraysh. However, if a Muslim renounced their faith and fled from Medina back to Mecca, the Quraysh were under absolutely no obligation to return them. As these terms were announced to the camp, a wave of profound, agonizing disbelief swept through the ranks of the 1,400 pilgrims. To the battle-hardened veterans who had survived the siege of the trench, this document did not look like a diplomatic resolution. It looked like an absolute, humiliating capitulation. They had marched to the edge of their holiest site, only to be turned away. They were being forced to agree to a wildly asymmetrical treaty that seemingly validated the supremacy of their oppressors. The brilliant, fiercely protective Umar ibn al-Khattab was so overcome with frustration and grief that he openly, passionately questioned the logic of accepting such heavily biased terms. The emotional devastation within the camp was absolute. Yet, looking at the parchment that his followers viewed as a humiliating defeat, the Prophet Muhammad saw an unparalleled, visionary triumph. He understood the long game. Muhammad possessed a strategic clarity that transcended the emotional volatility of the moment. He recognized that the ultimate enemy of Islam was not the Quraysh military, but the chaotic, perpetual state of warfare that prevented the message of monotheism from being clearly heard across the peninsula. By securing a 10-year truce, Muhammad had effectively neutralized the greatest military threat to his civilization. The treaty legally bound the hands of the Meccan elite, completely stripping them of their ability to launch massive, destructive campaigns against Medina. Furthermore, by signing a formal diplomatic treaty with the Prophet, the Quraysh had unconsciously committed a massive political blunder. They had officially, legally recognized the Islamic State of Medina as a legitimate, sovereign, equal power on the international stage. With the threat of Meccan violence removed, the immense, stifling cloud of fear that hovered over the independent Bedouin tribes of Arabia evaporated. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah created an unprecedented, massive window of absolute security. It allowed delegations, tribal chieftains, and common people from every corner of the vast desert to travel freely to Medina without the terrifying fear of Quraysh retaliation. As the heartbroken pilgrims broke their camp at Hudaybiyah and began the long, quiet march back to Medina, many still struggled to process the bitter pill they had been forced to swallow. But as the months turned into years, the absolute, undeniable brilliance of the Prophet's diplomatic concession began to manifest with explosive velocity. In the peaceful atmosphere generated by the treaty, the message of Islam, its profound call for universal justice, sweeping compassion, and absolute equality, spread through the Arabian Peninsula not at the edge of a sword, but through the undeniable magnetic power of its own ideological truth. The tribes, no longer blinded by the dust of perpetual war, listened, and they converted in massive, unprecedented numbers. Over the next 2 years, the population of the Muslim community would expand exponentially, completely eclipsing the numbers they had spent a decade fighting to achieve. The Quraysh, trapped behind the walls of their city by their own diplomatic arrogance, were forced to watch in absolute, helpless horror as the entire geopolitical landscape of Arabia fundamentally shifted around them. They had believed that by keeping the Prophet out of the Kaaba for a single year, They had won the war. They failed to realize that at Hudaybiyah, Muhammad had not surrendered. He had quietly, brilliantly conquered the future. For 2 full cycles of the desert seasons, a profound and highly unnatural silence blanketed the Arabian Peninsula. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah, forged in the suffocating tension of a dusty outpost, had functioned exactly as the Prophet Muhammad envisioned. The 10-year military truce effectively disarmed the violent, chaotic mechanisms that had defined the region for centuries. For the very first time in recent memory, the heavily armed caravans of Mecca and the agricultural merchants of Medina traversed the ancient trade arteries without the terrifying, ever-present specter of ambush and slaughter. In this unprecedented atmosphere of geopolitical stability, the nascent Islamic civilization experienced an absolute explosion of growth. The cessation of active warfare acted as an immense psychological pressure release valve for the independent Bedouin tribes scattered across the vast, unforgiving expanses of the desert. No longer forced to choose sides at the edge of a sword, tribal chieftains, nomadic leaders, and curious travelers journeyed freely to the radiant city of Medina. They came to witness this entirely new societal model firsthand. What they discovered was not a heavily militarized cult of personality, but an incredibly vibrant, highly structured society engineered upon the unshakable pillars of universal justice, sweeping civic compassion, and the absolute equality of all mankind before a single creator. Drawn magnetically to these revolutionary principles, massive swaths of the Arabian population voluntarily abandoned their ancestral polytheistic traditions. They pledged their allegiance to the Prophet, not out of military coercion, but through a profound, authentic, ideological alignment. Islam was flourishing peacefully, expanding its footprint across the sands with an unstoppable, terrifying velocity. 320 kilometers to the south, behind the opulent, sun-baked walls of Mecca, the ruling Quraysh aristocracy was suffocating on the bitter ash of their own diplomatic miscalculation. They had believed that the restrictive, highly asymmetrical terms of the treaty had successfully contained the Muslim threat. Instead, they were forced to watch in absolute, paralyzing horror as the geopolitical landscape of their entire world shifted irrevocably. Every day, fresh intelligence arrived in the Meccan council chambers, detailing yet another powerful allied tribe breaking their ancient pacts with the Quraysh to align themselves with the rising power in Medina. For generations, the elite families of Mecca had justified their staggering wealth and absolute political dominance through their role as the fierce, untouchable custodians of the Kaaba. But as the irresistible tide of monotheism swept across the peninsula, their highly curated aura of supremacy began to violently unravel. The realization that their empire was crumbling, not by the crash of steel, but through the overwhelming power of an idea, bred a toxic, incredibly volatile cocktail of paranoia, deep humiliation, and a desperate thirst to reassert their dominance. The older, more pragmatic leaders of the Quraysh recognized that they were trapped in a diplomatic cage of their own making, but younger, incredibly aggressive factions within the Meccan elite began to feverishly reconsider their stance on the truce. They felt the cold grip of irrelevance closing around their throats, and they were willing to burn the entire peninsula to the ground to break it. This simmering, toxic unease ultimately culminated in an act of staggering, catastrophic hubris. In the chaotic, highly complex web of Arabian tribal politics, both Medina and Mecca had acquired various allied tribes who fell under the protective legal umbrella of the Hudaybiyah Treaty. One night, under the cover of absolute darkness, the fragile peace was shattered. A Bedouin tribe firmly allied with the Quraysh executed a vicious, highly coordinated surprise attack against a neighboring tribe that had explicitly allied itself with the Muslims of Medina. This was not a minor, localized territorial dispute. The aggressors were actively, covertly supplied with weaponry and logistical support by prominent members of the Quraysh elite. Blood was spilled in the darkness, tearing the sacred parchment of the treaty to absolute shreds. This unprovoked night raid was a colossal political misstep and a betrayal of the highest magnitude. The Quraysh had deliberately, violently broken the very peace they had spent weeks agonizingly negotiating at Hudaybiyah. When the bruised and bloodied survivors of the attacked tribe desperately rode north, throwing themselves at the gates of Medina to demand the protection they had been legally promised, the news hit the Muslim community like a thunderbolt. The Prophet Muhammad, however, did not instantly mobilize his cavalry in a blind, reactionary rage. Operating with a terrifying, absolute diplomatic precision, he sought to completely expose the treachery of the Meccan elite on the international stage. Muhammad dispatched a highly formal, incredibly tense diplomatic envoy southward to the Quraysh. He presented the arrogant lords of Mecca with an absolute, unyielding ultimatum, offering them a final, desperately narrow window to rectify their catastrophic blunder. They were given the opportunity to publicly condemn the attack, pay the required blood money to the victims, and formally restore the integrity of the treaty, or face the absolute, undeniable consequences of a dissolved truce. Inside the Grand Council chambers of Mecca, the leadership completely fractured. Paralyzed by a deeply entrenched, blinding tribal arrogance, the Quraysh simply could not bring themselves to publicly admit their wrongdoing or submit to the legal demands of the man they had exiled. They fumbled the negotiations, offering arrogant deflections and entirely failing to provide a satisfactory, legally binding resolution to the crisis. By refusing the ultimatum, the Quraysh had officially, legally voided the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The 10-year truce was dead after only 2 years. The Meccan elite had essentially handed the architect of Medina the ultimate, legally justified casus belli the provocation for war. It was the year 630 CE, and the era of defensive survival in Medina was instantly, permanently terminated. Muhammad issued the command to mobilize, and the response from the Arabian Peninsula was unlike anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. Messengers rode out from the radiant city, carrying the call to arms across the vast, sprawling network of newly allied tribes. From the deepest desert valleys to the coastal plains, men answered the call, converging on Medina in a massive, overwhelming tidal wave of manpower. When the mobilization was complete, Muhammad stood at the vanguard of a terrifying, earth-shattering force of 10,000 heavily armed Muslim warriors. This was a number so completely overwhelming, so astronomically massive for the context of Arabian warfare, that it completely eclipsed the coalition force that had previously attempted to lay siege to Medina at the Trench. It was an unstoppable juggernaut of steel, faith, and absolute discipline. But the deeply profound, historically unique aspect of this massive army lay entirely in its core objective. As the 10,000 men began the heavy, thundering march southward toward the city of their former oppressors, Muhammad established an incredibly strict, highly unconventional psychological parameter for the campaign. This was not a march of bloody vengeance. This was not a campaign to slaughter the families of the Quraysh, to enslave their children, or to indiscriminately plunder the immense wealth of their grand estates. The objective was reclamation, driven by an unshakable commitment to ultimate peace. Muhammad sought to march back into the city of his birth, to reclaim the ancient Kaaba, the sacred house of Abraham, and to permanently restore the Valley of Mecca to a state of absolute, monotheistic harmony, completely cleansing it of the idolatry and tyrannical socio-economic hierarchies that had corrupted it for centuries. As the massive, heavily armed Muslim army slowly consumed the horizon, moving relentlessly toward the Meccan Valley, an incredibly dense, suffocating blanket of terror and anticipation gripped the entire city. The Quraysh intelligence scouts, observing the sheer, apocalyptic scale of the advancing columns, rode back to the city limits with faces pale as death. The mathematical reality was undeniable. The Meccan military apparatus, completely degraded by years of political isolation and economic strangulation, possessed absolutely zero chance of mounting a successful physical resistance against a unified force of 10,000 disciplined warriors. The absolute lords of the Arabian Peninsula found themselves staring directly into the terrifying, gaping maw of their own total annihilation. The city that had tortured the weak, starved the innocent, and built an empire on the back of ruthless exploitation was now completely, entirely exposed to the wrath of the very people they had victimized. For the Quraysh elite, it seemed an absolute, historical certainty that the Muslims would unleash a torrential, unstoppable wave of bloody retribution to avenge over a decade of horrific persecution, assassinations, and betrayals. Among the terrified Meccan leadership, one man truly comprehended the absolute finality of the moment. Abu Sufyan, the brilliant, highly pragmatic veteran tactician who had spent the better part of a decade utilizing all of Mecca's immense wealth and military might to hunt, starve, and destroy the Prophet, looked out at the approaching dust cloud and realized the game was permanently over. The age of the Quraysh supremacy was dead. Resistance was not just physically futile, it was an invitation to a massive, unnecessary slaughter of his own people. In a moment of staggering, desperate geopolitical calculation, Abu Sufyan made an incredibly dangerous decision. Under the heavy, oppressive cover of night, the great enemy of Islam quietly slipped out of the fortified city limits. Leaving behind the opulent safety of his ancestral home, he ventured out alone into the unforgiving, darkened desert, actively seeking the encampment of the 10,000 warriors. He was walking directly into the heavily armed vanguard of an army comprised of men whose families he had ordered killed. He was hoping to secure a desperate, last-minute diplomatic miracle to save his city from a river of blood. When the Meccan chieftain was intercepted by the Muslim patrols and escorted through the massive, heavily armed encampment, the psychological gravity of the moment was immense. He was brought before the man he had ruthlessly persecuted, humiliated, and exiled. The Prophet Muhammad was now sitting at the absolute pinnacle of Arabian power, surrounded by an army that was eagerly waiting for the command to unleash their vengeance upon the architect of their suffering. Yet, when Muhammad looked upon his greatest, most vicious adversary, he did not order his immediate execution. He did not subject Abu Sufyan to the humiliating, bloody theatrics of ancient conquest. Instead, operating with a profound, unearthly dignity that completely defied the brutal mechanics of human revenge, Muhammad received the Meccan leader with absolute respect. He offered his former enemy a staggering, unbelievable guarantee of personal protection and diplomatic reassurance. Muhammad laid out the terms for the conquest of the holy city, and they were breathtaking in their supreme mercy. He declared that a river of blood would not flow through the streets of Mecca. There would be absolutely no indiscriminate slaughter, no burning of homes, and no horrific acts of retribution. The Prophet established an incredibly precise, highly protective perimeter of safety for the terrified citizens waiting behind the walls. He instructed Abu Sufyan to return to his people and deliver a revolutionary decree. Anyone who locked the doors of their own home and remained inside would be absolutely guaranteed safety. Anyone who laid down their weapons and sought refuge within the sacred, ancient courtyard of the Kaaba would remain entirely unharmed. And in an incredible, deeply brilliant psychological elevation of his former enemy, Muhammad decreed that anyone who sought physical shelter inside the personal estate of Abu Sufyan himself would also be granted absolute, untouchable amnesty. His intentions could not have been articulated with greater, more profound clarity. He was holding the ultimate, unstoppable power of absolute destruction in his hands, and he was consciously, deliberately choosing not to use it. He sought a peaceful, bloodless entry into the heart of his enemies, entirely focused on a spiritual reclamation rather than a physical retribution. Stunned by this incomprehensible display of ultimate clemency, Abu Sufyan turned his back on the massive, shimmering encampment of the Muslim army and rode desperately back through the darkness toward the terrified city. He carried with him not a declaration of apocalyptic slaughter, but an urgent, frantic plea for his people to lay down their arms, to completely abandon their blinding hubris, and to trust the absolute word of the man they had spent a decade trying to destroy. The long, agonizing night eventually gave way to the pale light of dawn. The massive gates of Mecca stood before the 10,000. The ultimate climax of a bitter, defining conflict that had raged across the deserts for years was finally at hand, and the ancient city was about to witness a conquest unlike anything recorded in the violent annals of human history. When the morning sun finally broke over the jagged rim of the Meccan valley, casting long, dramatic shadows across the silent, breathless city, the vanguard of the 10,000 began their descent. In the annals of antiquity, the sack of a besieged capital was a terrifyingly predictable affair, characterized by the deafening roar of plundering armies, the breaking of gates, and the indiscriminate slaughter of the defeated. But as the massive Muslim columns poured into the streets of Mecca, an eerie, overwhelming quiet settled over the desert metropolis. The inhabitants, terrified of the impending retribution, remained barricaded behind their heavy wooden doors, waiting for the screams to begin. But the screams never came. At the head of this unstoppable tidal wave of martial power rode the Prophet Muhammad. He did not enter the city of his violent exile with the puffed chest and arrogant posture of a vengeful conqueror. There were no ostentatious parades, no taunting of the vanquished, and absolutely no celebration of his supreme, undeniable military victory. Instead, as his mount navigated the familiar, winding streets he had been driven from a decade earlier, Muhammad's demeanor was one of staggering, overwhelming humility. He rode with his head bowed, so low in profound gratitude to the divine that his forehead nearly touched the saddle, completely subverting the archetype of the ancient warlord. He ignored the opulent estates of the aristocrats who had tormented him. He bypassed the treasuries and the centers of political power. His destination was the exact center of the valley, the ancient, cubic stone sanctuary of the Kaaba. For centuries, this sacred structure, originally built by the patriarch Abraham as a monument to pure monotheism, had been co-opted by the Quraysh. They had weaponized the sanctuary, packing it with hundreds of stone and wooden idols representing the vast pantheon of Arabian tribal deities, utilizing them to maintain a highly lucrative, deeply oppressive socio-economic stranglehold over the peninsula. Muhammad's primary objective in marching 10,000 men across the desert was not the acquisition of land, but the absolute, permanent cleansing of this sacred space. As the massive army secured the perimeter of the sanctuary, Muhammad ordered the immediate removal of the false gods. One by one, the towering idols that had visually dominated the walls of the Kaaba and defined the spiritual and economic architecture of Mecca for generations were physically dismantled and dragged out of the precinct. The sound of stone shattering against stone echoed through the valley, not as an act of wanton vandalism, but as the deliberate, systematic deconstruction of an ancient, tyrannical world order, with each heavy idol that was toppled from its pedestal, erasing the symbols of polytheistic subjugation. Muhammad recited a profound, piercing verse from the Quran. His voice rang out across the courtyard. Truth has come, and falsehood has vanished. Indeed, falsehood is bound to vanish. With the courtyard finally cleared of its stone gods, Muhammad crossed the threshold and stepped into the cleansed sanctuary to offer prayers of intense dedication and overwhelming gratitude. He had not returned to Mecca as a king claiming his throne. He had returned as a restorer, successfully reclaiming the ultimate house of worship for the singular creator. The grand, visionary goal that had ignited in the terrifying darkness of the Cave of Hira had finally, miraculously materialized. But the physical cleansing of the Kaaba was only the first half of the conquest. The ultimate test of this new civilization lay in what the Prophet would do with the people who had built those idols. Following his prayers, Muhammad emerged into the blinding daylight of the courtyard. The military secures had rounded up the elite leadership of the Quraysh, the very architects of the starvation boycott, the torture campaigns, and the massive assassination attempts that had plagued the Muslims for over a decade. They were brought before him, standing defeated, humiliated, and utterly powerless in the shadow of the sanctuary they had once controlled. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a blade. The Meccan elite looked up at the heavily armed ranks of the 10,000 surrounding them, fully expecting the Prophet to unleash a perfectly justified, legally sanctioned bloodbath. In the context of ancient tribal law, their absolute extermination was not just expected, it was the standard operating procedure. They stood paralyzed by the terrifying memories of the atrocities they had personally inflicted upon the man standing before them. Muhammad looked out over the faces of his former oppressors. The silence was absolute. He finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the dusty stones of the courtyard. He asked them a single, chilling question. How did they think he was going to treat them? The defeated aristocracy, trembling and desperately grasping for a lifeline, murmured their hopes for the mercy of a noble brother. The Prophet's response shattered the psychological foundations of the ancient world. He did not issue a decree of execution. He did not order them to be shackled as slaves, nor did he demand crippling financial reparations to bankrupt their estates. Instead, drawing upon the profound, timeless spiritual lineage of the prophets who preceded him, he delivered a verdict of absolute, unbelievable clemency. "I say to you what Joseph said to his brothers," Muhammad declared, his words echoing against the walls of the Kaaba. "There is no blame on you today. Go, for you are free." The impact of this single sentence was catastrophic to the old order of Arabia, yet infinitely more powerful than the swing of 10,000 swords. It was an act of supreme, unparalleled forgiveness that completely transcended human logic. By consciously choosing ultimate mercy over highly justified retribution, Muhammad completely disarmed the psychological defenses of the Quraysh. He proved in a single, breathless moment that Islam was not an ideology of tribal dominance or bloody conquest, but a profound, unstoppable force of healing, compassion, and ultimate unity. The stunned people of Mecca, overwhelmed by a magnanimity they could barely comprehend, felt their deeply entrenched hatred and blinding arrogance evaporate. Moved entirely by this staggering display of grace, the citizens of the city, including the most hardened, vicious enemies of the early Muslim state, began to voluntarily, willingly embrace the faith. The conquest of Mecca was finalized without a siege, without a massacre, and without the agonizing chains of subjugation. The city of exiles had been transformed overnight into a sanctuary bound not by the paralyzing grip of fear, but by the unbreakable, unifying bonds of faith. The staggering, bloodless reclamation of Mecca sent a seismic shockwave rippling outward from the spiritual center of the Arabian Peninsula. The unimaginable had transpired. The absolute, untouchable stronghold of Quraysh supremacy had been quietly dismantled by mercy rather than fire. Yet, the fall of the city did not signal the immediate pacification of the entire desert landscape. Arabia was incredibly vast, fiercely tribal, and deeply suspicious of centralized authority. While many nomadic clans watched the Prophet's stunning display of clemency, and traveled to Mecca to voluntarily align themselves with this new, egalitarian society. Others viewed the rapid expansion of Islamic influence not as a beacon of justice, but as a terrifying, existential threat to their independence. Deep in the rugged, unforgiving highlands beyond the Meccan Valley, a formidable counter-movement was rapidly coalescing. The fiercely martial tribes of the Hawazin, along with the heavily armed Thaqif from the fortified city of Taif, outright rejected the new geopolitical reality. They possessed no desire to bow to the new monotheistic order. Viewing the Prophet's recent victory as an aggressive encroachment upon their ancestral sovereignty, these tribes consolidated their military assets, forging a massive, heavily armed coalition. They gathered their fighters, their wealth, and their families at a strategic, treacherous valley known as Hunain, entirely determined to launch a preemptive strike capable of shattering the Muslim momentum. Aware of this brewing, apocalyptic storm, Muhammad immediately mobilized. The army that marched out of Mecca was an awe-inspiring spectacle. Swelled by the incredibly recent integration of thousands of newly converted Meccans, the Muslim force now numbered a staggering 12,000 warriors. It was, by all metrics of the ancient Arabian world, an absolutely invincible force. But sheer numbers are a deeply deceptive currency in the theater of war. As the massive, 12,000-strong column slowly navigated into the narrow, winding, and heavily shadowed defiles of Hunain, a dangerous complacency had settled over the ranks. The fresh Meccan recruits, intoxicated by the sheer size of their own army, believed defeat was a mathematical impossibility. They were catastrophically wrong. The Hawazin coalition had utilized the rugged topography of the valley with terrifying brilliance. Concealed deep within the jagged cliffs and hidden crevices of the canyon, they waited until the vanguard of the Muslim army was entirely trapped in the bottleneck. Then they unleashed hell. Without a single warning sound, a devastating, highly coordinated ambush rained down from the heights. A blinding storm of arrows and a ferocious downhill cavalry charge slammed violently into the unsuspecting Muslim vanguard. The psychological shock of the surprise attack was absolute. The newly converted Meccan fighters, lacking the ironclad discipline, the deep spiritual resolve, and the bitter combat experience forged by the veterans of Badr and the Trench, completely panicked. The structural integrity of the massive army disintegrated in seconds. Chaos swallowed the valley as thousands of terrified men broke ranks, dropping their weaponry and attempting to frantically flee the slaughter, entirely collapsing back upon their own advancing columns. It was a moment of supreme, blinding terror that threatened to completely undo the victory of Mecca in a single afternoon. Yet, amidst the deafening roar of the ambush and the crushing tide of retreating men, the Prophet Muhammad remained absolutely immovable, refusing to yield a single inch of ground. He anchored his mount directly in the center of the chaotic slaughter. Surrounded by a small, impenetrable wall of his most seasoned, fiercely loyal veterans, Muhammad raised his voice above the din of the battle, desperately rallying his fleeing soldiers. The sight of their leader standing entirely fearless in the face of the enemy barrage acted as a powerful psychological shock to the retreating forces. The veterans stabilized the breaking lines, countercharging with an incredibly desperate, furious intensity. The momentum of the battle violently shifted. The Muslims, recovering their discipline and fueled by an unshakable resolve, brutally dismantled the Hawazin ambush, ultimately turning a near-catastrophic rout into a hard-fought, definitive victory. The Battle of Hunain served as a chilling, necessary reminder to the growing empire. Ultimate success was never guaranteed by the sheer volume of swords, but by the unyielding depth of their spiritual unity. Following the collapse of the hostile coalition at Hunain, Muhammad turned his attention to the final remaining pocket of significant resistance. the walled, highly fortified mountain city of Taif. The history between the Prophet and the city of Taif was deeply scarred by trauma. Years prior, during the absolute lowest point of his persecution in Mecca, Muhammad had walked to Taif seeking refuge, only to be brutally mocked, stoned, and chased out of the city by its leaders. Now, he stood outside their massive gates, commanding an army capable of utterly annihilating them. The inhabitants of Taif braced for the inevitable bloody retribution. But once again, Muhammad completely subverted the brutal mechanics of ancient warfare. He initiated a siege, but as the days stretched on, he chose patience over destruction. Recognizing that breaking the walls would result in a massive loss of life, he eventually lifted the siege and simply walked away, leaving the city completely isolated but physically unharmed. He gave the people of Taif the most valuable, terrifying gift an ancient warlord could offer: time. He offered them a period to independently witness the shifting reality of the peninsula, allowing the profound concepts of Islam to penetrate their society without the edge of a blade. This brilliant, highly restrained psychological strategy yielded absolute success. Cut off from their former allies, and deeply moved by the Prophet's refusal to enact his rightful vengeance, the leadership of Taif eventually traveled to Medina and voluntarily submitted to the new faith. The last great fortress of opposition had fallen to patience. With the Arabian Peninsula increasingly pacified and the ancient tribal rivalries dissolving into the fabric of a unified monotheistic brotherhood, the Prophet transitioned from military commander back to the grand architect of civilization. He recognized that political unity was incredibly fragile unless it was permanently bound by robust, equitable socio-economic structures. He fundamentally revolutionized the concept of wealth in the ancient world by formally institutionalizing zakat. This was not a system of voluntary, sporadic charity designed to ease the conscience of the wealthy. It was a highly structured, mandatory economic mechanism woven directly into the spiritual fabric of the religion. Those possessing surplus wealth were legally and morally obligated to surrender a highly specific percentage of their assets to support the destitute, the orphans, the widows, and the most vulnerable fringes of society. Zakat transformed the economy from a predatory system of relentless hoarding into a circulating engine of communal welfare, effectively outlawing the concept that any member of the community should be allowed to completely fall into starvation or ruin. Simultaneously, Muhammad established the Hajj pilgrimage as an essential, unifying pillar of the Islamic framework. By commanding Muslims from every distant corner of the newly unified peninsula to converge on the Kaaba in Mecca, he engineered the greatest socio-political equalizer in human history. Men who had once viewed themselves as absolute enemies, separated by vast oceans of blood and tribal lineage, were now stripped of their opulent markers of status. They wrapped themselves in the exact same simple, unstitched white cloth, moving in perfect, rhythmic unison around the sacred sanctuary. The Hajj obliterated the ancient hierarchies, cementing an incredible visual reality. Before the eyes of the Creator, the elite merchant and the former slave were entirely, fundamentally indistinguishable. The vision of Medina was no longer confined to the oasis. It had swallowed the desert, but Muhammad possessed an incredibly sophisticated geopolitical awareness that extended far beyond the dunes of Arabia. He understood that for Islam to survive in the broader theater of human history, it had to announce its presence to the titans that ruled the earth. He initiated an audacious, highly formal diplomatic outreach, dispatching official envoys carrying meticulously drafted letters to the most terrifying, powerful monarchs of late antiquity. He extended invitations of peace and diplomatic exploration to Heraclius, the emperor of the vast Byzantine Empire, and to Khosrow Roman II, the absolute sovereign of the Sassanid Persian Empire. While these global powers were locked in their own apocalyptic struggles, the arrival of these humble desert ambassadors signaled a profound shift. It was an unmistakable declaration that a completely new, incredibly unified geopolitical force had just been born on their southern borders, a civilization built on justice and diplomacy that intended to permanently engage with the wider world. By the year 632 CE, the Arabian Peninsula had undergone an unimaginably profound metamorphosis. The fractured, endlessly warring, polytheistic landscape of the past had been completely overwritten. From the rugged northern frontiers to the coastal southern ports, a massive, interconnected community now thrived, bound not by the archaic chains of tribal blood, but by a shared, unshakable belief in a single God and a universal moral code. But even as he looked out over the staggering, sprawling civilization, he had spent 22 agonizing, incredibly beautiful years building from the dust up. A heavy, quiet intuition settled over the prophet. He sensed that the monumental task he had been given in the dark, suffocating confines of the Cave of Hira, was finally reaching its absolute completion. His earthly journey was entering its final twilight, and he possessed one last, crucial message to deliver to the world before the curtain fell. The staggering, bloodless reclamation of Mecca sent a seismic shockwave rippling outward from the spiritual center of the Arabian Peninsula. The unimaginable had transpired. The absolute, untouchable stronghold of Quraysh supremacy had been quietly dismantled by mercy rather than fire. Yet, the fall of the city did not signal the immediate pacification of the entire desert landscape. Arabia was incredibly vast, fiercely tribal, and deeply suspicious of centralized authority. While many nomadic clans watched the prophet's stunning display of clemency and traveled to Mecca to voluntarily align themselves with this new, egalitarian society, others viewed the rapid expansion of Islamic influence not as a beacon of justice, but as a terrifying, existential threat to their independence. Deep in the rugged, unforgiving highlands beyond the Meccan Valley, a formidable counter-movement was rapidly coalescing. The fiercely martial tribes of the Hawazin, along with the heavily armed Thaqif from the fortified city of Taif, outright rejected the new geopolitical reality. They possessed no desire to bow to the new monotheistic order. Viewing the prophet's recent victory as an aggressive encroachment upon their ancestral sovereignty, these tribes consolidated their military assets, forging a massive, heavily armed coalition. They gathered their fighters, their wealth, and their families at a strategic, treacherous valley known as Hunain, entirely determined to launch a preemptive strike capable of shattering the Muslim momentum. Aware of this brewing, apocalyptic storm, Muhammad immediately mobilized. The army that marched out of Mecca was an awe-inspiring spectacle. Swelled by the incredibly recent integration of thousands of newly converted Meccans, the Muslim force now numbered a staggering 12,000 warriors. It was, by all metrics of the ancient Arabian world, an absolutely invincible force. But sheer numbers are a deeply deceptive currency in the theater of war. As the massive, 12,000-strong column slowly navigated into the narrow, winding, and heavily shadowed defiles of Hunain, a dangerous complacency had settled over the ranks. The fresh Meccan recruits, intoxicated by the sheer size of their own army, believed defeat was a mathematical impossibility. They were catastrophically wrong. The Hawazin coalition had utilized the rugged topography of the valley with terrifying brilliance. Concealed deep within the jagged cliffs and hidden crevices of the canyon, they waited until the vanguard of the Muslim army was entirely trapped in the bottleneck. Then they unleashed hell. Without a single warning sound, a devastating, highly coordinated ambush rained down from the heights. A blinding storm of arrows and a ferocious downhill cavalry charge slammed violently into the unsuspecting Muslim vanguard. The psychological shock of the surprise attack was absolute. The newly converted Meccan fighters, lacking the ironclad discipline, the deep spiritual resolve, and the bitter combat experience forged by the veterans of Badr and the Trench, completely panicked. The structural integrity of the massive army disintegrated in seconds. Chaos swallowed the valley as thousands of terrified men broke ranks, dropping their weaponry and attempting to frantically flee the slaughter, entirely collapsing back upon their own advancing columns. It was a moment of supreme, blinding terror that threatened to completely undo the victory of Mecca in a single afternoon. Yet, amidst the deafening roar of the ambush and the crushing tide of retreating men, the Prophet Muhammad remained absolutely immovable. Refusing to yield a single inch of ground, he anchored his mount directly in the center of the chaotic slaughter, surrounded by a small, impenetrable wall of his most seasoned, fiercely loyal veterans. Muhammad raised his voice above the din of the battle, desperately rallying his fleeing soldiers. The sight of their leader, standing entirely fearless in the face of the enemy barrage, acted as a powerful psychological shock to the retreating forces. The veterans stabilized the breaking lines, countercharging with an incredibly desperate, furious intensity. The momentum of the battle violently shifted. The Muslims, recovering their discipline and fueled by an unshakable resolve, brutally dismantled the Hawazin ambush, ultimately turning a near-catastrophic rout into a hard-fought, definitive victory. The Battle of Hunain served as a chilling, necessary reminder to the growing empire. Ultimate success was never guaranteed by the sheer volume of swords, but by the unyielding depth of their spiritual unity. Following the collapse of the hostile coalition at Hunain, Muhammad turned his attention to the final remaining pocket of significant resistance, the walled, highly fortified mountain city of Taif. The history between the Prophet and the city of Taif was deeply scarred by trauma. Years prior, during the absolute lowest point of his persecution in Mecca, Muhammad had walked to Taif seeking refuge, only to be brutally mocked, stoned, and chased out of the city by its leaders. Now, he stood outside their massive gates, commanding an army capable of utterly annihilating them. The inhabitants of Taif braced for the inevitable bloody retribution. But once again, Muhammad completely subverted the brutal mechanics of ancient warfare. He initiated a siege, but as the days stretched on, he chose patience over destruction. Recognizing that breaking the walls would result in a massive loss of life, he eventually lifted the siege and simply walked away, leaving the city completely isolated but physically unharmed. He gave the people of Taif the most valuable, terrifying gift an ancient warlord could offer: time. He offered them a period to independently witness the shifting reality of the peninsula, allowing the profound concepts of Islam to penetrate their society without the edge of a blade. This brilliant, highly restrained psychological strategy yielded absolute success. Cut off from their former allies, and deeply moved by the Prophet's refusal to enact his rightful vengeance, the leadership of Taif eventually traveled to Medina and voluntarily submitted to the new faith. The last great fortress of opposition had fallen to patience, with the Arabian Peninsula increasingly pacified and the ancient tribal rivalries dissolving into the fabric of a unified, monotheistic brotherhood. The Prophet transitioned from military commander back to the grand architect of civilization. He recognized that political unity was incredibly fragile unless it was permanently bound by robust, equitable socio-economic structures. He fundamentally revolutionized the concept of wealth in the ancient world by formally institutionalizing zakat. This was not a system of voluntary, sporadic charity designed to ease the conscience of the wealthy. It was a highly structured, mandatory economic mechanism woven directly into the spiritual fabric of the religion. Those possessing surplus wealth were legally and morally obligated to surrender a highly specific percentage of their assets to support the destitute, the orphans, the widows, and the most vulnerable fringes of society. Zakat transformed the economy from a predatory system of relentless hoarding into a circulating engine of communal welfare, effectively outlawing the concept that any member of the community should be allowed to completely fall into starvation or ruin. Simultaneously, Muhammad established the Hajj pilgrimage as an essential, unifying pillar of the Islamic framework. By commanding Muslims from every distant corner of the newly unified peninsula to converge on the Kaaba in Mecca, he engineered the greatest socio-political equalizer in human history. Men who had once viewed themselves as absolute enemies, separated by vast oceans of blood and tribal lineage, were now stripped of their opulent markers of status. They wrapped themselves in the exact same simple, unstitched white cloth, moving in perfect, rhythmic unison around the sacred sanctuary. The Hajj obliterated the ancient hierarchies, cementing an incredible visual reality. Before the eyes of the creator, the elite merchant and the former slave were entirely, fundamentally indistinguishable. The vision of Medina was no longer confined to the oasis. It had swallowed the desert. But Muhammad possessed an incredibly sophisticated geopolitical awareness that extended far beyond the dunes of Arabia. He understood that for Islam to survive in the broader theater of human history, it had to announce its presence to the titans that ruled the earth. He initiated an audacious, highly formal diplomatic outreach, dispatching official envoys carrying meticulously drafted letters to the most terrifying, powerful monarchs of late antiquity. He extended invitations of peace and diplomatic exploration to Heraclius, the emperor of the vast Byzantine Empire, and to Khosrow Roman II, the absolute sovereign of the Sassanid Persian Empire. While these global powers were locked in their own apocalyptic struggles, the arrival of these humble desert ambassadors signaled a profound shift. It was an unmistakable declaration that a completely new, incredibly unified geopolitical force had just been born on their southern borders, a civilization built on justice and diplomacy that intended to permanently engage with the wider world. By the year 632 CE, the Arabian Peninsula had undergone an unimaginably profound metamorphosis. The fractured, endlessly warring, polytheistic landscape of the past had been completely overwritten. From the rugged northern frontiers to the coastal southern ports, a massive, interconnected community now thrived, bound not by the archaic chains of tribal blood, but by a shared, unshakable belief in a single God and a universal moral code. But even as he looked out over the staggering, sprawling civilization, he had spent 22 agonizing, incredibly beautiful years building from the dust up. A heavy, quiet intuition settled over the prophet. He sensed that the monumental task he had been given in the dark, suffocating confines of the Cave of Hira was finally reaching its absolute completion. His earthly journey was entering its final twilight, and he possessed one last, crucial message to deliver to the world before the curtain fell. The return from the sun-baked plains of Mount Arafat to the cooling, palm-shaded courtyards of Medina marked the closing of a magnificent, impossibly arduous circle. Muhammad, the man who had been hunted like an animal through the jagged ravines of Mecca, now reigned as the undisputed architect of a unified, continental civilization. The sprawling, incredibly diverse tribes of the Arabian Peninsula had been seamlessly woven into a single, cohesive fabric of faith, bound by the unshakable principles of justice, radical compassion, and absolute monotheism. He had cultivated an empire not merely of land, but of the human heart. Yet, as the days lengthened into the quiet, golden afternoons of the oasis, an undeniable, heavy physical toll began to manifest. The human body, even one driven by an unparalleled cosmic purpose, possesses its absolute limits. 2 decades of agonizing starvation, grueling military campaigns, relentless psychological warfare, and the crushing, profound weight of receiving divine revelation had slowly, systematically drained the prophet's physical reserves. His health began a steep, highly visible decline, casting an incredibly long, somber shadow over the radiant city. The Muslim community, watching their beloved leader grow frail, was gripped by a quiet, suffocating terror. For 22 years, his physical presence had been their absolute North Star. He had been their ultimate shield in times of apocalyptic war, their impeccable judge in times of bitter dispute, and the living, breathing conduit to the divine. The terrifying prospect of navigating the treacherous currents of the ancient world without him was a reality they desperately struggled to comprehend. Despite the agonizing deterioration of his physical strength, Muhammad refused to surrender his final hours to rest. He utilized whatever remaining energy he possessed to actively prepare his people for the inevitable transition. He spent his days surrounded by his fiercely loyal companions, his family, and the common citizens of Medina, pouring out his final reserves of wisdom. He relentlessly hammered home the absolute core values that had built their sanctuary: the strict protection of the vulnerable, the necessity of unyielding integrity, and the sacred obligation of charity. He reminded them that the ultimate source of their power was not the swords they carried, but the absolute, unwavering unity he had spent his life forging. As the illness intensified, gripping his body with fierce fevers and debilitating weakness, the prophet gathered his closest, most trusted confidants for an incredibly poignant, devastatingly tender farewell. In a voice stripped of its former booming resonance, but heavy with profound, unearthly grace, he expressed his deepest, most absolute gratitude for their unbreakable loyalty. He had asked them to abandon their homes, to bleed on the slopes of Uhud, and to starve in the ravines of Mecca, and they had never once abandoned him. He urged them to remain fiercely steadfast in the darkness that was to come, reminding them one final time that the enduring words of the Quran and the meticulous example of his life were the only guides they would ever truly need. The defining, incredibly symbolic moment of the transition occurred when Muhammad's physical body finally failed him to the point that he could no longer stand to lead the daily communal prayers in the mosque. For a community whose entire spiritual rhythm was dictated by the prophet standing at their vanguard, this absence was a staggering, deeply traumatic realization. In this critical moment, Muhammad made a deeply calculated, highly profound executive decision. He explicitly appointed his oldest, most steadfast companion, Abu Bakr, to step forward and lead the congregation in his place. This was not merely a logistical substitution. It was an immensely powerful, highly visible geopolitical and spiritual endorsement. By placing Abu Bakr at the head of the prayer, Muhammad was subtly, brilliantly indicating his absolute trust in the man's ability to maintain the stability and continuity of the fragile Islamic state after his passing. In his final, fleeting days, as the fever consumed him, Muhammad retreated to the incredibly modest, unadorned quarters of his beloved wife, Aisha. She was a towering figure of intellect and devotion within the community, and it was within the quiet intimacy of her small room that the architect of the Arabian Revolution spent his last hours. The man who had received the crushing weight of the cosmos in a dark cave, who had shattered the invincible armies of the Quraysh, and who had rewritten the moral code of humanity, now lay quietly, resting his heavy head against Aisha. With his final, shallow breaths, he did not speak of empires, of wealth, or of military conquests. Looking beyond the veil of the physical world, he whispered his ultimate, defining desire. "O Allah," he breathed, with the highest companion. And with those words, the Prophet Muhammad passed from the earth. The moment the news breached the thin walls of Aisha's quarters and spilled into the dusty streets of Medina, the city completely, violently shattered. The grief was an absolute, suffocating tidal wave. Men who had stood completely fearless against the terrifying cavalry charges of the Meccan elite collapsed into the dirt, weeping uncontrollably. The psychological anchor of their entire existence had been ripped away, plunging the community into a state of blinding, incomprehensible shock. The devastating reality of his mortality was so profoundly difficult to accept that Umar ibn al-Khattab, one of the fiercest, most brilliant, and physically imposing leaders of the Muslim army, completely rejected the news. Driven by a desperate, heartbreaking denial, Umar drew his sword in the center of the panicked crowd, furiously threatening to execute anyone who dared to utter the lie that the Prophet of God was dead. His blinding grief perfectly mirrored the terrifying, collective paralysis of the entire civilization. It was in this absolute epicenter of chaos that Abu Bakr, demonstrating the exact, unshakable clarity that had earned him the title of the Truthful, stepped forward to save the community from tearing itself apart. He walked past the drawn sword of Umar, his face a mask of profound sorrow, yet incredibly absolute, ironclad resolve. He addressed the weeping, terrified congregation with a declaration of such magnificent philosophical power that it instantly halted the panic and eternally grounded the Islamic faith. If anyone worships Muhammad, Abu Bakr's voice rang out, steady and commanding, let them know that Muhammad is dead. But if anyone worships Allah, let them know that Allah lives and never dies. The brutal, magnificent honesty of those words pierced the hysteria. It was the ultimate, defining reminder that Islam was never a cult built around the worship of a mortal man. It was a universal, eternal message. Umar's sword fell to the dust, his legs giving way as the absolute, crushing reality finally set in. The community, steadied by Abu Bakr's immense wisdom, found their footing in the dark. In the incredibly tense, highly critical days that followed, the absolute survival of the entire geopolitical experiment rested on a razor's edge. At a gathering known as the Saqifa, the leadership of Medina fiercely debated the mechanics of succession, demonstrating the incredibly robust, consultative framework that Muhammad had instilled within them. They did not look to royal bloodlines or inherited aristocracy to find a king. They chose Abu Bakr as the first caliph, the successor, electing him based entirely on his impeccable character, his profound intellect, and his unwavering, absolute commitment to the preservation of justice. While the political architecture of the empire was being secured, the Prophet was laid to rest in a manner that perfectly reflected the absolute, astonishing humility of his life. He was buried in the exact spot where he had taken his final breath, beneath the dirt floor of Aisha's modest room. His grave was deliberately left unmarked, a final, towering testament to his deeply held conviction that earthly monuments, material wealth, and the trappings of royal status were completely, utterly irrelevant before the infinite majesty of the divine. The physical life of Muhammad had ended, but the shockwave of his existence was only just beginning to violently reshape the globe. Under the brilliant, highly disciplined leadership of the early caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, the incredibly potent ideological engine forged in Medina exploded outward. They systematically pacified the rebellious tribes of Arabia, restoring the absolute unity of the peninsula, and then pushed beyond the burning sands. Within a matter of decades, the brilliant, highly motivated armies of Islam engaged and utterly dismantled the ancient, decaying superpowers of the Byzantine and Sassanid empires. The message of radical equality, strict justice, and absolute monotheism poured into North Africa, surged across the Levant, and pushed deep into the ancient, highly sophisticated territories of Persia. As the empire expanded, transforming into a vast, unprecedented, multicultural civilization, the Muslims did not simply conquer, they absorbed, integrated, and profoundly elevated the societies they encountered. They instituted massive administrative reforms, established vast public welfare systems to protect the destitute, and implemented groundbreaking legal protections for Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, formally guaranteeing their absolute right to religious freedom. This incredibly dynamic, rapidly expanding civilization eventually gave birth to the magnificent Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties. The capital of this vast, sprawling world shifted from the humble date palms of Medina to the glittering, highly advanced metropolis of Baghdad. Here, in the legendary House of Wisdom, the true, ultimate legacy of the Prophet's command to seek knowledge materialized in an explosion of human intellect. While Europe languished in the dark, the Islamic Golden Age ignited. Brilliant Muslim scholars, working in harmonious, interdisciplinary collaboration with Christian and Jewish intellectuals, meticulously translated and preserved the absolute greatest philosophical and scientific works of ancient Greece, India, and Persia. They mapped the exact movements of the stars, invented the incredibly complex discipline of algebra, revolutionized the practice of medicine, and built the highly sophisticated intellectual bridge that would eventually spark the European Renaissance and the birth of the modern world. All of this, the towering libraries of Baghdad, the stunning geometric architecture of Andalusia, the absolute preservation of human knowledge, and a global faith that continues to guide the daily lives of billions, can be traced backward through the corridors of time. It all traces back to an orphan shepherd, sitting entirely alone in a dark, suffocating cave on a jagged mountain, waiting for a voice in the silence. He was a man who was offered the absolute wealth of the sun and the moon, and chose instead to build a society where the weak were protected, where justice was blind, and where humanity was bound together by the profound, unbreakable grace of a single creator. As the echoes of clashing steel and ancient desert winds slowly fade into the quiet expanse of history, the heavy, magnificent tapestry of this era draws to a close. The great caravans have rested. The fires of ancient empires have burned down to soft, glowing embers in the hearth of time. Here, in the tranquil quiet of the sleep scriptorium, the relentless march of the centuries gives way to the peaceful, absolute stillness of the present moment. Let the weight of the day slip from your shoulders, just as the armor of the past was laid down in the sands. Close your eyes, let your breathing slow to the gentle, rhythmic cadence of a world finally at peace, and allow your mind to drift seamlessly into the quiet, starlit corridors of history. The story has ended, and now sleep well, sweet dreams. Good night.